under the orange sky, among the scorched ruins, Desir stood motionless. His long, dark hair flowed beneath the heavy cloak draped over his shoulders, where a blue circle surrounded a vivid orange emblem. The remnants of war and devastation marked the landscape. Rubble littered the ground, a silent testament to the final battle within the deepest level of the Shadow Labyrinth. This was humanity's last trial, the darkest layer the Shadow World had ever revealed. Desir took a step forward, weaving through the rubble. Smoke rose in twisting columns around him. As he turned, a massive presence loomed behind. A colossal dragon, forged of stone and malice, towered with 3 glowing red eyes and enormous wings spread wide. This was Boromir Napolitan, a meteorite-grade destruction dragon. The beast's voice echoed across the battlefield, mocking the defiance of those who had dared to oppose him. Flames began to swirl within his gaping maw, a prelude to annihilation. 2 factions stood on either side of the battlefield, armed with swords, spears, and magic. Desir stepped forward, one hand outstretched and gloved in black. The faces of the fallen flashed through his mind. The red-haired warrior who fell pierced by arrows and spears. The blue-haired comrade whose chest was run through. The crying purple-haired girl was bleeding in his arms. A decade had passed in this endless abyss, 10 years filled with sacrifice and pain. Desir, scarred and weary, stood tall once again. With unwavering resolve, he declared that this nightmare would end. As the dragon roared, the ground quaked and rocks tumbled. Desir's voice rang clear through the chaos. They would destroy this beast and escape the torment. Magic circles glowed with intense blue light around him. His fingers curled around the seal, lightning crackling in defiance. He announced the completion of the final magical analysis. Then, with clenched teeth and focused rage, Desir sealed the dragon's magic. From behind, Raffaello, the blonde knight with a ponytail, praised Desir's brilliance. A red-haired warrior with a patterned face sprinted forward, rallying the others. Together, the heroes charged, weapons raised. The dragon, battered and defeated, levitated briefly before crashing to the earth. Smoke billowed in the orange-tinged clearing as silence settled over the battlefield. The mighty carcass of the dragon lay like a shattered monument. Fluffy clouds, tinged with gold, drifted above. In the center of the stony field, 6 heroes sat together. Raffaello, the radiant knight of light, commended everyone for their efforts. They had saved the world. Doni Vasilin, the muscular blonde king of Esteban with a beast skull adorning his chest, broke the celebratory mood. He questioned why the purge message had not appeared. According to the rules of the Shadow World, the task had been completed with the dragon's death. Raffaello scratched his nose, puzzled by the delay. They should have returned home instantly. One of the survivors noted that this Shadow World felt different from the others. Perhaps waiting a little longer was necessary. To his right, a man in a hood observed quietly. Only 6 out of 150 million had survived, leaving a survival rate of 0.00004%. Zod Exarian, the great sage and master of the Tower of Mages, spoke with a mixture of awe and sadness. The number was absurdly low. A pink-dressed girl with long hair urged him to stop calculating. No numbers would bring back the dead. She raised her head as voices over the communication device echoed. Processing the loss would take time, especially with so many lives lost. Desir laughed lightly. Despite the grief, they had saved the world. Opposite him, a blonde girl in a light dress looked at him with amber-brown eyes. The girl in pink turned to Raffaello, joking that they would have failed without him. He waved it off with a grin. As a paladin, protecting others came naturally. Instead, he acknowledged that Desir had played the most vital role. Asylin agreed. Without Desir, they would not have succeeded. Desir scratched his head, embarrassed, and asked them to stop exaggerating. The girl in pink glanced at Exarian, who looked at Desir and admitted his surprise. He had expected Desir to die much earlier. Despite being only a third-circle magician, Desir had managed to analyze and seal a dragon's magic, a feat even Exarian, a 7th-circle mage, could not comprehend. The others murmured in amazement. How could someone of such limited rank possess such incredible skill? Desir responded with humility. He was a commoner who had not received proper magical education. With better training, he might have saved many more. Exarian expressed regret. If someone like Desir had been part of the magic tower, they would have given him full support. The air grew solemn. Raffaello clapped his hands and broke the tension. He reminded everyone that the past was behind them. They had people to return to. When asked about future plans, Asylin said he would visit the homes of his fallen comrades, returning their belongings and honoring their memories. Desir nodded solemnly. The girl in pink announced she would return to the Western Kingdom's alliance to comfort the families of the dead. She hoped to build a shrine to honor their sacrifice. Exarion, arms crossed, vowed to find a way to prevent the reappearance of the Shadow Labyrinth. If a world like this emerged again, the consequences would be catastrophic. Turning to Ajest, Raffaello asked what she planned to do. She said nothing and turned away, leaving the others in silent surprise. Raffaello smiled knowingly and turned to Desir. Wherever he went, Desir would surely be welcomed. Asylum invited him to travel together. Someone asked if he would return to Hebrion Academy. Desir did not answer. He stared into the distance, deep in thought. Suddenly, the dragon's eye opened. Desir leaned forward as Napolitan's red-orange gaze reignited. The others froze, confused. Cries of disbelief rang out. Had they not completed the mission? Was the dragon not truly dead? Exarion, furious, shouted in denial. He had confirmed the death himself. Asylum stared ahead in silence. Exarion, adjusting his broken glasses, shared a memory from an old book. The dragon's heart functioned like a mana engine, similar to a mana circle. It absorbed and distributed energy. When a dragon died, the energy became unstable. An image formed of a glowing red dragon, arms spread, unleashing uncontrollable power. The accumulated mana would cause a catastrophic explosion. Desir explained grimly that no one had killed a dragon before. This was the first time in history. The ground trembled, stones rattled. Someone asked if Desir had known. He admitted he had not. Exarion warned that the mana release surpassed 7th circle magic. Analysis was pointless. They had to prepare for the worst. A radiant explosion surged forward, tearing the earth apart. Raffaello clenched his teeth, whispering that the world would truly end. The girl in pink clasped her hands in prayer. Ajest stared forward, lightning crackling around her. Desir, covered in white cracks, shut his eyes. He saw his worn hands transform into younger, unblemished ones. When he opened his eyes, he found himself in a different place. A boy in a blue shirt stared at his reflection in a nearby pane of glass. Short hair, familiar eyes. Desir, once a hero at the edge of despair, had returned to the beginning. The surrounding crowd turned in shock toward the source of the sudden shout. Confused murmurs rippled as they questioned the strange behavior of the dark-haired young man. Desir, the one who had cried out, stared at his hands in disbelief. His mind reeled. By all rights, he should have been dead. Yet there he stood, alive, surrounded by a bustling hall. Magical chandeliers suspended above glowed with the light of embedded stones, casting a gentle brilliance over the area. The air buzzed with movement, boots clicking against the polished floor. Everyone's attention shifted in the same direction as the sound of firm footsteps echoed. Desir looked as well. A woman stomped confidently in her golden-toed high-heeled boots, demanding the focus of the room. She possessed a commanding presence, with short blonde hair and a curvaceous figure. Her voice rang out clearly as she introduced herself as Bridget, a professor at Hebrion Academy. She welcomed the attendees, expressing appreciation for their efforts in coming to the academy, especially those hoping to gain admission. Desir stared at her, jaw slightly agape. Whispers traveled through the gathering. Some students murmured about how attractive the professor was. From behind the podium, Bridget snapped sharply at the group furthest from her, warning them not to speak while she did. After taking a breath to calm herself, she continued. Her expression grew more serious as she announced that not all of them would be accepted. The weight of her words settled heavily across the hall. Eyes turned toward Desir, whispers spreading among the crowd again. According to tradition, candidates were required to pass an entrance exam. Bridget confirmed this, explaining that only the top 600 performers would earn admission into Hebrion Academy. Tension rose. Uneasy conversations broke out among the students. Many wondered what sort of test awaited them, but no one had an answer. Bridget then revealed that their exam would involve purifying a shadow world. Her words aligned precisely with Desir's thoughts, causing him to freeze. He bent forward, covering his face with one hand, overwhelmed by disbelief. What was happening before him made no sense. Bridget reassured the crowd that the shadow world they would face was not real. It had been created specifically for the purpose of the entrance examination. Desir stared at her with a hand over his mouth. Nothing felt real anymore. Bridget maintained a friendly tone as she gestured toward the mentors who would provide further guidance. The announcement was made. The year 3613 entrance exam would commence in 2 hours. She bid them farewell for the moment, leaving the stage. Desir, still visibly shaken, pushed past the confused crowd and pressed a hand against a gray pillar. His breaths came heavy and uneven. This was unmistakably the Hebrion Academy entrance ceremony. His mind conjured a vivid image of the Academy's golden crest, a grand H, emblazoned on a shining shield. Desir's eyes widened as the realization struck. He had already passed through this phase over 10 years ago. If the current year was 3613, then the shadow world he remembered entering had occurred in 3616. He had been trapped there for 10 long years, and in 3626, the world had met its ruin. Somehow, he had returned 13 years into the past. His heart pounded as the truth settled in. Images of blood-stained cloaks, skeletal remains, and shattered weapons surged through his mind. Every sacrifice, every loss endured in those 10 years, they had all been in vain. He bent down, clenched his teeth, and pressed his forehead against the pillar. Silent tears fell. Around him, the crowd continued to laugh and chatter, blissfully unaware. Desir gripped the fabric of his shirt tightly. Behind the lively crowd, he dropped to his knees, burying his face in his arms. His shoulders shook. A blue flag bearing the Academy's golden emblem fluttered above. Whispers floated nearby, identifying him as a commoner. Some pitied him. Still seated on the steps, Desir kept his eyes closed, trying to gather himself. His memories remained intact, every detail, every name. He knew who he had been. He covered his face again, trying to compose his thoughts. A voice interrupted his spiral. A girl appeared beside him, calling his name. Desir looked up. She had red hair and wore a plaid skirt. In one hand she held a tablet, the other planted on her hip. Clearly displeased, she mentioned that he had failed to show up at their agreed meeting point. She introduced herself as Ladoria von der Riche, a second-year student assigned as his mentor. Desir stood and apologized. Ladoria turned away, still a little irritated, but quickly softened her expression. She told him she looked forward to working with him. As she returned her gaze to the glowing screen of her tablet, Desir watched her carefully. He remembered Ladoria well. She was a brilliant fire mage who would later reach the sixth circle. Throughout her time at the academy, she had consistently been the top student. She glanced up and asked Desir what was on his mind. He simply admitted he was nervous. Ladoria laughed lightly and told him not to worry. The constructed shadow world used for the exam could not compare to the real thing. Desir looked at her in surprise. She explained that the exam would determine his potential to participate in shadow world cleansings. Her tablet glowed again. Ladoria asked if he was a commoner. He remained silent. She responded quickly, stating that it should not affect his eligibility for admission. However, her tone shifted slightly. She warned that even if he performed well, being a commoner would place him in the beta class, where the quality of education would be far inferior. Desir's thoughts darkened. He pictured lavishly dressed aristocrats contrasted against modest villagers in straw hats and plain clothes. The disparity was unmistakable. Hebrion Academy was built on a system of discrimination. Aristocrats dominated the alpha class. Commoners were forced into the beta class regardless of their abilities. As they walked down the corridor, Ladoria remarked that such worries could wait until after the exam. She then turned and asked if he knew what the shadow worlds were. He nodded, prompting her to observe him closely, hands resting on her hips. She reminded him that full knowledge of shadow worlds was essential. Even fabricated versions could be dangerous. Desir assured her he understood. He imagined countless doors and portals floating in the void. He explained that the shadow world was a parallel universe, a catastrophic phenomenon unlike anything humanity had faced. These realms appeared annually, endless in variety, governed by distinct rules. Some were easy, while others posed immense threats. He continued, saying each shadow world was shaped by past events. The magical society had classified them into 10 levels based on historical significance. Lower-level worlds posed higher dangers. The most alarming aspect was their corrosive nature. They devoured reality, leaving behind darkened, uninhabitable lands. No one could say what transpired within them. One truth remained: nothing living returned from those territories. Ladoria stared at him, clearly impressed. Desir's expression grew grave. He concluded that cleansing shadow worlds was humanity's only hope for survival. Ladoria stood with arms crossed, irritation clearly written across her face. After coughing once, she raised 2 fingers and stated that 2 major forces now monitored the shadow worlds. She revealed a blue coat of arms bearing the image of scales, explaining that this represented the union of the Western kingdoms. In contrast, she presented the golden crest of Hebrion Academy, identifying both as competing factions. Their rivalry lay in collecting magic stones and cleansing the shadow worlds, a task required of all affiliated academy members. While Midoriya continued, she imagined a shadowed figure in a black cloak hidden within the darkness. Inwardly, she acknowledged the presence of a third, lesser-known group of outsiders. However, she reasoned that it was still too early for Desir to learn about them. With her back turned, Midoriya asked Desir if he understood what it meant to cleanse a shadow world. Desir, walking behind her, confirmed without hesitation. As he stepped forward, he envisioned himself wading into an otherworldly realm. Beneath him, his mirrored self treaded through darkness scattered with glowing grains of golden sand. Desir explained that shadow worlds were essentially parallel universes that replayed moments from the past. They manifested across the world and posed a threat that could only be resolved through intervention. In his mind, he pictured himself trapped inside an hourglass, beneath which nights clashed violently. He stated that the objective was simple: enter the shadow world and cleanse it. To illustrate, he conjured an image of a battlefield where a blue banner stood raised over a mountain of fallen soldiers. If the scenario was based on a past war where one side had been defeated, then cleansing it meant securing victory in that war. Each shadow world presented a specific scenario and a goal. Once the task was completed, the world would be cleared. Desir emphasized that the entire global structure revolved around these cleanings, with both the Western Kingdoms and Hebrion Academy playing pivotal roles. He stood beside Midoriya in the corridor. She turned toward him, surprised at how much he already understood. With a smile, she acknowledged that he had a solid grasp of the basics, and they could now move forward. They approached a tall, multi-story structure adorned with golden railings. Midoriya announced that they had arrived at the academy's main building. She hurried to the sliding glass doors and held up a purple student card. A circular seal appeared beside it. A mechanical voice responded, confirming the student card and welcoming her as a fourth circle magician. As the doors opened, she moved forward confidently. Desir followed quietly into the wide hall, taking in the vast space. Midoriya almost skipped through the crowd, weaving between students who stood at the base of a wide blue staircase and leaned along the balcony of the second floor. Desir glanced upward, observing groups of chatting students and the fluttering banners that bore the academy's insignia. His expression remained composed, though tinged with a subtle melancholy. Midoriya noticed this and commented on his lack of reaction. Desir replied with a soft smile, noting that he had seen a similar structure before. She laughed in disbelief and asked again to be sure. They continued down a sunlit corridor lined with windows. Without warning, Midoriya stopped abruptly, her gaze narrowing toward a figure approaching from the opposite direction. Ahead stood Pram, the blue-haired boy, arms folded confidently across his chest. Behind him walked a long-haired girl. Smirking, Pram taunted Midoriya, suggesting she was late. Desir asked whether she knew him. She confirmed and identified the blue-haired boy as Elheim, a water mage and her longtime rival. Their incompatibility extended beyond elemental magic and into personality clashes. Desir, understanding the situation, joked that they clearly did not get along. Midoriya responded with a flare of temper, expressing her deep dislike for Elheim's arrogance. Elheim leaned back with mock amusement, commenting on her small stature and the time it must have taken her to arrive. Midoriya countered with a defiant smile, remarking that he remained the same vile person he had always been. His smile twisted into something sharper as he dismissed her with contempt, calling her a pathetic fire mage. In response, Midoriya reminded him that she had defeated him just last month. Elheim's expression darkened. He claimed that she had misunderstood mercy for victory and warned that such ignorance was the reason she remained behind him. Though Midoriya's smile stayed firm, her clenched fists and tense features revealed her anger. She warned that if his current skills represented his limit, he might as well quit the academy. The air between them grew tense as the two stood face to face, eyes locked like predators circling before a fight. Elheim eventually exhaled and turned to Desir. Assuming he was Midoriya's apprentice, Elheim addressed him with thin courtesy and asked for his name. Desir introduced himself plainly. Elheim checked his tablet and chuckled darkly. He asked if Desir was a commoner, then mocked Midoriya for mentoring someone beneath noble status. According to Elheim, their competition was already over. Midoriya asked what he meant. He handed her a tablet, pointing out the group assignments. On the screen, 4 names were listed: Desir Herrman, Ajest Kingscrown, Romantica Eru, and Treviri Tychus. Elheim sneered, claiming Desir had no chance. Lidoria crossed her arms and said victory was still possible. Elheim scoffed, asserting that a commoner like Desir stood no chance against someone like Ajest. Lidoria's eyes widened at the name. She questioned if he was being serious. Elheim encouraged her to confirm it herself. She turned to the long-haired blonde who had stepped forward. Ajest introduced herself calmly. Desir gave her a polite nod, recognizing her from earlier visions in the Shadow World. Lidoria checked her profile on the tablet, confirming that Ajest was indeed a magical swordswoman with an ice element, a third circle magician, and a practitioner of image magic. Her fencing was ranked above the pawn class. Elheim gloated inwardly, likening Ajest to a venomous snake coiled to strike. Lidoria glanced between Ajest and Desir, reluctantly admitting that Desir appeared outmatched. Elheim laughed, asking where her confidence had gone. He strolled past them, still grinning. As he passed Desir, Elheim delivered one final remark. Even if Desir passed the entrance exam, he would inevitably end up in the worthless beta class. He advised him to quit before wasting more time. Desir watched him walk away. Behind him, Lidoria raged silently, fists trembling. Below, Desir focused on Ajest with interest, comparing her appearance now with the vision he had seen inside the Shadow World. A small smile touched his lips. Lidoria, still angry, kicked a stone across the hallway. At that moment, a voice echoed from a wall-mounted speaker, announcing the start of the entrance exam. All examinees were instructed to proceed to the examination hall. Annoyed, Lidoria turned to Desir and asked why he was smiling. Desir simply replied that it was time to go. The candidates gathered in a spacious hall. At its center stood a circular platform surrounded by several golden doors. Desir examined one of the doors, his eyes carefully scanning the intricate magical seals etched across its surface. Folding his arms across his chest, he placed a hand under his chin in thought. He paced from one spot to another, clearly focused, now aware of what she looked like again. A voice interrupted his thoughts, asking him to stay still and accusing him of bringing disgrace. The speaker was a brown-haired girl dressed in a pink suit, her twin ponytails swaying as she frowned at him. Standing behind her were two others, clearly her teammates. Desir's eyes widened in shock. Recognition flashed through him as he realized who the girl was. It was Romantica. Without hesitation, Desir rushed to her and gripped her shoulders, frantically asking if she was hurt or if anything had happened to her. Romantica looked confused, unsure what he was talking about. As he absorbed her bewildered reaction, Desir suddenly cursed inwardly, realizing he had forgotten something important. Grabbing his head in dismay, he took a step back. Romantica recoiled in surprise, wrapping her arms around herself, visibly unsettled. Desir muttered a quiet apology, admitting that something had overcome him. Romantica snapped at him, accusing him of being arrogant. A voice nearby asked if she was all right, drawing Desir's attention. He pressed his lips together, knowing this sort of reaction was inevitable, though it still affected him. Despite her anger, he felt a deep sense of relief. She was alive. His thoughts drifted to the memory of holding her lifeless body in the rain. Her fragile frame had collapsed in his arms. He remembered the sky above, howling in anguish, drowning in despair. The pain had been unbearable, and he had believed there was nothing left. However, this time was different. This time, she stood before him. He glanced at Romantica again, noting how she stood guarded beside Pram, who wore a navy blue battlesuit and held a sword. That scene confirmed his conviction. He had returned to a time before death took them. This was a second chance, and he would not waste it. Desir clenched his fist with determination. He swore to himself that he would never let her die again. Suddenly, a loud voice echoed through the hall. It was the host of the examination, announcing the next task. The group would be transported into a level 10 Shadow World simulation, specifically a race across the Earnest Plains. The host explained that the objective was simple: reach the finish line first. It was located 8 kilometers from the starting point. Magic use and attacks against other participants were permitted. The host added that their pain sensations would be reduced by 80% due to the simulation's safety settings. If anyone suffered a fatal injury or chose to give up, they would be removed from the Shadow World. As the candidates lined up in front of the golden doors, Treviri leaned toward Romantica and commented on their luck. He mentioned that Group B had been assigned to fight trolls, while their group merely had to run. Romantica replied that apart from Ajest, only she and Treviri would be competing. They exchanged brief words of encouragement. The golden doors shimmered with a white light. Desir stood beside Romantica, Pram, and Ajest as the door activated. Their forms faded and reappeared on a vast green plain with a river flowing nearby. The host's voice declared their arrival in the shadow world and instructed them to move to the starting line. The race would begin in 3 minutes. Desir took position at the glowing blue line. He glanced at the others. Ajest stood calmly, her expression unreadable. Desir greeted her nervously. She stared forward, unfazed, giving no reply. He wondered if she, too, had been pulled back in time. As always, her thoughts remained impenetrable. He flinched slightly when she finally spoke. Without turning her head, Ajest coldly remarked that he was weak. Desir remained still, disappointed, though not surprised. He responded quietly, admitting that he knew. Ajest corrected him, claiming that he did not understand just how weak he truly was. She listed his flaws. His magical capacity was low, his physical strength below average, and he was unlikely to surpass a level 6 shadow world. Romantica and Treviri whispered to each other nearby while Desir nervously flexed his fingers. He wondered if Ajest intended to attack him. She assured him that she had no interest in fighting someone like him. Her expression remained distant. She claimed that her mentor had said the same thing. Desir looked at her curiously and asked why she wouldn't attack. Ajest turned slightly toward him, then looked away again. Standing tall in the open meadow, she declared that she had no desire to waste her strength on someone so weak. The host's voice boomed once more, announcing that the race would start in 10 seconds. Dust stirred in the air. Herbalists on the field tensed in anticipation. The host reminded them to prepare themselves. Desir stood with a tense expression. Ajest simply nodded. Romantica stretched her arms and grinned confidently, her eyes glowing with energy. Treviri smirked and tightened his stance. When the signal was given, all 4 surged forward. Ajest took the lead instantly, with Treviri close behind. Dust kicked up behind them, obscuring the field and forcing Desir and Romantica to cough and squint as they ran behind the leading pair. Romantica cursed the dust and shouted in frustration. As they pressed on, a small brown creature with a green hat appeared in the grass. Romantica accidentally stepped near it, causing it to tumble. Turning mid-stride, she apologized to the creature and called it cute. Desir mumbled that she still seemed to like such things. Romantica scowled and snapped at him, demanding to know why he thought he understood her. She ordered him to focus on the race. Desir insisted there was no point pretending. They would both fail if they remained behind. Romantica's expression twisted with frustration. Veins bulged on her forehead as she yelled at him to shut up and stop acting like they were friends. Despite her anger, Desir smiled softly. Romantica began swinging her fists at him, furious and confused, asking what was wrong with him. She wanted to know why he kept annoying her. Desir said nothing about their shared past. He only expressed his happiness at seeing her again after such a long time. Romantica misunderstood and furiously asked if he was glad just because they were running together. Her tone became sharp as she shouted that he was driving her crazy. Desir turned his head when she stretched her arm forward, signaling that she had waited long enough. She announced that it was time to demonstrate her strength. Her face flushed red as she ran. She declared that a commoner like him would never reach the second circle. As they neared the entrance to the green forest, she added that he would never witness magic like hers. Romantica cast her spell with force. With her palm extended, a magical seal formed beneath her. She shouted the incantation, "Arrow Sweep." A man in a blue shirt stood with a tablet in his hands, announcing that Groups A and C had completed their assignments, leaving only Groups D and F. He added that nothing unusual had occurred so far. Glancing at the blue orb resting on a red base, he noted that everything was proceeding smoothly. At a large round table, several observers focused on holographic blue screens. One remarked that this year's students were performing remarkably well. A few older evaluators exchanged glances before one pointed out that the previous cohort had also been impressive. However, this year featured a magical swordswoman, which made the difference. Another noted that she embodied the ideal of a true aristocrat. Someone else mentioned that she had been placed in Group D, alongside commoners. Laughter followed as one of them remarked that he did not envy whoever had to lead that group. Professor Bridget observed the screen, her lips forming a faint smile despite the usual sternness of her expression. Meanwhile, the forest trees blurred past in green streaks as Ajest and Trebi sprinted forward. Close behind, Treviri tried to keep up. Breathing heavily, he furrowed his brow, finding the race suspiciously simple. He considered himself a swordsman and assumed he should easily win a mere foot race. Clenching his fists, he pushed forward through the dense forest. Suddenly, Treviri stumbled to a halt. Li Fiam appeared before him without warning. Nearby, Ajest continued to run, clearly struggling for breath. Treviri glanced at her and could not hide his amazement at her sheer endurance and determination. She was no ordinary swordswoman. As Trebi led the way, Treviri followed, wondering where their strange path would lead. A gust of wind rushed past. Leaves swirled around him as Treviri halted, feeling something unnatural in the air. The wind grew fiercer until a full-blown magical current surged in his direction. He raised his arms instinctively as the pressure pushed against him with unrelenting force. Gritting his teeth, he crossed his arms over his chest, barely holding his ground. The magical intensity overwhelmed him. He recognized the signature, Romantica. Reacting quickly, Treviri plunged his sword into the earth and grabbed the hilt. He anchored himself to withstand the magical storm. From the strength of the gusts, he deduced Romantica intended to sweep them away entirely. Fortunately for him, his armor gave him a considerable weight advantage, nearly 100 kilograms. As long as he clung to the blade, he believed he could resist. He smirked and wondered if this was the full extent of Romantica's power. Before he could think further, Ajest darted past him, blade drawn. The blonde slashed through the air as though it were paper. Treviri's eyes widened in disbelief at her speed and composure. She cut through the wind with grace and precision, advancing straight into the gale without hesitation. Her breathing was ragged, eyes narrowed, but her pace never slowed. Sweat streaked down Treviri's face as he watched, stunned by her willpower. He glanced around, calculating. Despite her progress, the storm would soon take its toll on her stamina. He considered waiting it out. However, the wind's intensity escalated rapidly. Trees in the vicinity began to wrench free from the earth, their roots exposed and trembling. Panic gripped Treviri. His brows knitted tightly. He questioned if this outcome had been Romantica's plan all along. The image of her earlier expression, filled with confidence and a touch of malice, surfaced in his mind. It reminded him of a devil. As one of the trees tore free and hurtled toward him, his rage peaked. Tears spilled from his eyes as he shouted furiously at Romantica, his voice swallowed by the roaring wind. The tree crashed into him with a thunderous impact, silencing his complaints. Above, the sky cleared. Professor Bridget raised her eyes to the display as the wind dissipated. The host's voice echoed, announcing that Treviri Tychus had been eliminated from the Shadow World. Only 3 participants remained: Ajest, Romantica, and Desir. Romantica sprinted across the field, frustration evident on her face. Her fists clenched tightly, eyes focused ahead. She muttered her disappointment that Ajest had not been taken out. Increasing her pace, she declared that it was Desir's turn now. Desir slowed and turned toward her, puzzled. Romantica winked and tapped her cheek, suggesting she was giving him a chance to surrender. She implied he might want to avoid the pain. Desir responded with a smile, politely declining her offer. Romantica smirked and closed her eyes, seemingly pleased with his choice. The calm quickly vanished as she opened her eyes wide, shouting in disbelief. She asked whether he truly failed to understand what her magic could do. Her voice trembled with indignation. Staring at Desir's composed expression, she demanded that he stop smiling. Lowering her head, Romantica's magic surged. Sparks danced around her. She muttered a warning, then reminded Desir that this world did not permit death. Blue magic circles appeared, one after another, encircling her as the magical pressure increased. Her gaze grew sharp and hostile. She warned Desir that she would not hold back, so he had better endure. Once the spell reached its peak, Romantica clasped her hands and released the air strike. A barrage of magical beams erupted from the seals. The force of the attack shook the ground. Desir raised a hand casually, still smiling. Moments later, an explosion rocked the area. Chunks of earth flew in all directions. A dense cloud of dust rose, engulfing everything. Romantica stood within the dust cloud, reflecting. She realized that a second circle spell had hit Desir directly at close range. Even another magician of equal rank would not have withstood it. Shielding her eyes with one hand, she allowed herself a grin. It had been enjoyable, but it was time to end it. Unexpectedly, Desir appeared behind her. He commented on how she had launched a direct strike right after compressing her magic. His sudden movement caught her off guard. Desir turned with wide eyes, hand resting on his chin. He coughed softly, brushing away the dust. Then he calmly explained the similarities between her earlier spell and the one just used. Placing his hands on his hips, he smiled proudly and told her that for a second circle magician, her performance was outstanding. Romantica stared at him, stunned. Her mouth hung open in disbelief, unable to process how he had survived. Desir placed his hand under his chin, deep in thought. He acknowledged the impressive speed behind Romantica's attack, although she had overlooked a critical factor: airflow control. Due to this neglect, the spell's accuracy had diminished, allowing Desir to redirect it slightly. Romantica stared at him, wide-eyed and stunned, her mouth slightly agape. She stammered, demanding to know how he had managed to alter her spell. Desir raised his hand to his chest, where a translucent energy ring shimmered faintly around his wrist. He calmly explained that he had simply analyzed her magic. As he observed the ring, it started to disintegrate. Before he could finish assessing it, Romantica, clearly irritated, rushed at him with her fists clenched, yelling that a first-circle magician should not mock her intelligence. Desir maintained his composure and insisted he was telling the truth. Romantica's expression darkened, her eyes widened as she clenched her teeth, appalled by the idea that someone she perceived as a commoner had analyzed her magic. A memory surfaced in her mind, an image of a young magician with a single seal, who had grown old and mastered control over fire, wind, and water. She understood that a thorough analysis required complete comprehension of magical theory and rune application, a level only achievable by archmages. Confused, she questioned how someone like Desir could possess such capabilities. Romantica balled her fists. Magical seals shimmered around her once again. With a stern voice, she declared the time for jokes was over. She had missed her mark, but she was not finished. Her fury built, and she shouted that she would never lose to Desir. As she channeled her power, sharp tips emerged from her seals, linked by chains, and surged forward. Desir responded by waving his hand, a faint smile playing across his face. 2 magical rings appeared around him. He asked her to observe carefully. By shifting his hand slightly and altering the trajectory of several air currents, every single projectile missed its mark and embedded itself harmlessly into the ground. Romantica's hand trembled as her expression shifted to surprise. Desir snapped his fingers, dissipating the rings at his wrist. He told her that with better control, she had the potential to become a great magician. Frustrated, Romantica lowered her hand and clenched it into a fist. She found the situation ridiculous. If Desir truly was using analysis magic, then his understanding far surpassed her own. She glanced at him again. The dark-haired figure flexed his wrist casually. She realized he was no ordinary student, he was gifted. Desir took a step forward. He calmly stated that their match needed to end. There was someone else whose victory held greater importance. Romantica's eyes widened in disbelief. As he approached, she shut her eyes tightly, her fists trembling. Tears welled in the corners of her eyes as she screamed in defiance, refusing to accept defeat. Desir paused, observing her shaking hand. Romantica opened her tear-filled eyes and glared at him. She claimed that since he could not use magic, she would eventually win. Desir, still puzzled by her reaction, acknowledged her strength inwardly. Among the first-year students, he believed only one other could rival her power. Yet he also knew it would not be enough. A painful memory resurfaced, Romantica, lifeless in his arms, her body limp as he cried out in grief. Desir allowed himself a faint smile. That future would not repeat itself. Observing her stance, feet firmly planted, fists clenched, he thought she had the potential to grow stronger. However, to unlock that strength, he needed to surpass her. Romantica's confusion deepened when Desir called her by name. She froze as he pointed out 3 mistakes she had made. Raising his index finger, he reminded her that while he was not powerful, he could still use magic. He then added that she had never been his true target. With a calm expression, he raised 3 fingers, signaling the 3rd error. Romantica watched as he activated a spell, an ice-sliding enchantment. 2 glowing seals appeared beneath his feet, followed by a smudging spell. She observed silently, recognizing the spell as a low-level physical magic used to reduce friction. She could not understand why he had cast it during their duel. Suddenly, her eyes widened further. She pressed her boots firmly into the grass, suspecting that Desir aimed to trip her. Despite bracing herself, the ground remained stable. Confused, she questioned whether the spell had failed. Desir began speaking again, highlighting her 3rd mistake. Smiling, he extended his index finger. She seemed to have forgotten that this Shadow World trial was not about magical combat, it was a race. Spreading his arms, he asked where she thought he had applied the smudge. Romantica muttered, assuming the spell had failed due to poor execution. He shook his head and covered his face with one hand, disappointed. She protested, asking him not to look at her like that. Placing his hand over his chest, Desir revealed that he had applied the smudge to himself. He remained silent as she asked what difference that made. He then posed a question about Newton's third law. Romantica frowned and admitted she knew the principle. Desir asked her to imagine someone being pushed from behind with great force, one comparable to an explosion. She admitted he would be propelled forward. As realization struck her, Desir prepared a fireball behind him. The red-orange energy flickered wildly. Romantica grew frantic, warning that he might crash or injure himself at such speed. Yet Desir gently reminded her of something she had told him: death was not possible in this world. At that moment, Desir activated the fireball. A massive burst erupted, launching him forward in a streak of speed. Dust exploded in his wake. Romantica lost her footing and tumbled to the ground, eyes wide in shock. As she lay in the grass, she questioned where such a wild person had come from. Meanwhile, Ajest had surged far ahead in the race. She turned to glance behind and immediately recognized the boy gaining on her. She adjusted her stance and extended her arm, readying herself for a confrontation. Her blonde eyebrows furrowed as she locked eyes with Desir, now racing at incredible speed. Despite everything she had assumed, this was the same so-called weakling. The grass shifted beneath Ajest's feet as she sprinted forward, closely followed by Desir, who surged ahead after a short delay. Despite her speed, Ajest sensed that Desir would eventually catch up. As she ran, her eyes locked on the glowing blue line ahead, signaling the finish. Realizing he was closing the gap, she resolved to stop him. While running, Ajest recalled Romantica. The memory of her strength passed briefly through her thoughts. However, since Romantica had failed to appear, it meant Desir had defeated her. Accepting this, Ajest glanced over her shoulder and decided not to restrain her power. Turning swiftly, she raised a hand, conjuring a radiant sphere that glowed at her palm. She began chanting, declaring her dominance in battle, comparing herself to an unshakable sea and a fortress of water. Her spell concluded with a call for the enemy to be overwhelmed by her magic. In the sky before Desir, seals burst into view, entwined with glowing blue threads. He looked up, startled by the sight. Dozens of magical formations hovered overhead, all aimed at him. Ajest, her arm extended and the sphere still shining, stood unmoved. She stated that whatever Desir used to defeat Romantica would not work against her. Desir, clenching his fists, maintained his pace. He acknowledged Ajest's incredible speed and casting ability. Despite the overwhelming magic before him, a smirk formed on his lips. He believed she still underestimated him. Closing his eyes sharply, he activated a spell. Upon reopening them, a cluster of red seals appeared in front of his right eye, enhancing his analysis. Through his lens, the blue seals began to glow faint red. Desir studied each group carefully as their structure shifted under his gaze. He completed the analysis of 180 spells, granting him access to the corresponding 180 magic arrows. Ajest's eyes widened, and she instinctively jumped back, gripping her sword tightly. Desir pressed forward, noting that his reaction time matched that of a sixth circle magician. Ajest realized that any delay would give Desir complete access to her magic. She raised her hand again, now charged with blue lightning, and fired a spell meant to end the match. Desir furrowed his brow, eyes narrowed beneath 3 glowing seals. He shouted for a directional adjustment as an explosion erupted in front of him, sending a towering column of smoke into the air. Blue arrows rained down, several pierced Desir's body, striking his arm, shoulder, and legs. Despite the pain and smoke, he pressed on. Ajest observed him through the haze, trying to understand how he had defeated Romantica. Desir stood, bleeding heavily. The left side of his face and body dripped with blood, and a deep wound above his knee slowed his movements. His left sleeve had been torn off, revealing the damage. Ajest quickly realized Desir had redirected the arrows away from his vital points. She raised her head, calculating that they were now 200 meters apart. 21 of her magic arrows remained. Blue seals shimmered behind her, while Desir stood amid the thick smoke, gripping his injured arm. 4 seals floated around him. She noted that he had already taken control of 4 of her spells. Her light brows furrowed. If she could not win by numbers, she would overpower him by force. Her strategy shifted. The blue seals behind her converged, forming a single large sphere, glowing at its core. The formation took the shape of a magical tome, radiating intense blue light. Desir planted his feet firmly into the ground, holding his wounded arm. He acknowledged that Ajest had stopped holding back. As she drew her sword, sparks of blue light shimmered around her. Despite the pain, Desir gave a faint smile. Blood slid from his lip, yet his focus remained unshaken. He believed Ajest had made the wrong move. She raised her palm again, releasing a powerful attack with a sharp magical tip. Desir responded by activating 4 blue seals. From them, a single magic arrow launched. He dashed forward, using the momentum. When the arrow met Ajest's magic, an explosion erupted. Though partially deflected, her attack surged onward, heading straight for Desir. With 3 red seals near his eye, Desir narrowed his gaze and lifted 2 fingers, triggering another analysis. A portion of Ajest's magical structure turned red as he seized control. Without slowing, he clenched his fist and gave another directional command. Part of Ajest's attack was redirected to collide with the remainder of her magic, resulting in a massive explosion that blanketed the field in thick dust and smoke. Standing near the finish line with her sword drawn, Ajest turned sharply at the sound. The eruption had come from behind. Disbelief flashed across her face as she muttered that such a result was impossible. Out of the swirling dust, Desir's hand emerged. Ajest's jaw tightened. She realized he had used the recoil from the explosion to propel himself forward. Desperate, she reached for her weapon. However, the brunette dashed past her, his wounded body now ahead. The blue finish line approached rapidly. Ajest spun around in shock, watching as Desir cleared the boundary with a single leap. Blood streamed down the left side of his face. He exhaled heavily, his body barely upright. Behind him, Ajest began to sheath her weapon. She gripped the handle tightly and drove it fully into its scabbard, producing a sharp, echoing sound. Desir remained still, eyes lifted to the sky. Green blades of grass floated through the air as silence settled over the field. A moment later, the announcer's voice rang out, declaring that the shadow world had been cleared. The meeting room glowed under a lamp fixed to the ceiling. Professors in blue robes filled the space, either seated around a large table or standing nearby. A man with red hair and gold earrings sat at the table, his brows furrowed in thought. Another professor, this one bearded, stared forward with a grim expression. A glowing sphere in the center of the table projected holographic displays while the group exchanged opinions. One professor noted that, as usual, nothing had changed this year. A man with a scar across his face folded his arms and bared his teeth, commenting on the absence of commoners in the alpha class. Another, with slicked back hair, closed his eyes and rested his chin on one hand, stating that this was expected. The alpha class catered exclusively to aristocrats, leaving no room for commoners lacking formal education. Another professor agreed, nodding in support of Professor Fergman's remark. Bridget, seated elegantly, traced the rim of her glass with a finger. The professor with green hair offered a slight smile while his neighboring colleague, whose stern demeanor never softened, remained silent. One of them argued that commoners should be grateful for admission into the academy at all. The head professor struck a wooden stand with a gavel, commanding silence. A formidable man with a long gray beard braided neatly sat nearby, his presence enough to command attention. He stated that one final student remained under review. A document sat on the table. The professor presented the candidate as Desir Herrman, a first-circle magician. A red-bearded professor exchanged a glance with his colleague, who had red hair. They recognized the student as someone grouped with the magic swordswoman. The professors reacted with mild shock, surprised that a commoner had managed to reach such a level. Desir's photo hovered in the hologram before them. Reactions shifted swiftly from skepticism to disbelief. The blue-haired professor found it difficult to accept that Desir had defeated Ajest. The one with orange earrings appeared equally astonished, questioning how it was possible. The rector, seated at the head, exposed his teeth slightly as he spoke. He had heard of Desir's arrival at the academy through a recommendation letter and inquired about the sponsor. Bewildered stares met his question. None could believe that someone had endorsed a commoner. Bridget crossed her arms and legs, a subtle grin on her face, revealing she had recommended Desir. The rector narrowed his eyes at her, pressing for the basis of her decision. Bridget calmly explained that Desir had studied magic for a long time and remained eager to improve. His dedication and talent had stood out clearly. The rector listened with his hands folded, asking how they had met. Bridget recalled encountering Desir by chance at an orphanage. The rector, pensive, brought a finger to his mouth before inquiring about Desir's pre-test results. An assistant reported that Desir had barely completed the first lap. Professor Fergman sneered, mocking Desir's lack of competence. Bridget, unbothered, summoned a small magic circle above her raised finger, requesting everyone watch the recording. The sphere flared to life with magic circles, initiating the playback. The scene displayed Desir darting forward, unleashing magical arrows and advancing through Group D's trial. Dust clouds trailed behind him as he sprinted ahead. Blood marked his face, yet he stood tall on the green field. The system confirmed the shadow world had been cleared. The bearded professor's eyes widened, mouth falling open. His colleague adjusted his glasses, stunned. Neither expected such performance from a mere teenager. The burgundy-haired professor raised a hand, acknowledging he had underestimated the spell Desir had used, believing it no more than a basic technique. Meanwhile, the pink-haired professor noted Desir's ability to manipulate magical algorithms directly. A professor in dark glasses also contributed, noting Desir's exceptional computing skills. The video showed Desir exhaling deeply, eyes narrowed. The professor added that Desir possessed tactical awareness and psychological insight, like a seasoned warrior. All eyes turned to the rector, expressions stern. The professors insisted Desir should be accepted, unable to understand why his admission had not been finalized. The rector acknowledged Brigitte's push for Desir's placement in Alpha class. Fergman's rage surfaced as his face reddened and eyes narrowed. He regarded Bridget with contempt, branding her manipulations as a recurring annoyance. Bridget, still poised, responded with a wicked grin as Fergman erupted, declaring that Academy rules dictated only second circle magicians and above belonged in Alpha. He demanded an explanation for including a first circle student. Other professors murmured in agreement. The red-bearded professor insisted rules must be observed. The red-haired professor echoed this, asserting that first circle magicians lacked the qualifications. Fergman sneered in Brigitte's direction, determined to prevent her from bending the system. Bridget, unfazed, remarked on the absurdity of Fergman's logic. She reminded everyone that Desir had defeated a third circle swordswoman, and to deny him on grounds of rank alone was dishonest. Bridget accused Fergman of discrimination, claiming his real objection stemmed from Desir's background as a commoner. Fergman's fury intensified. The rector brought the room to order by striking the gavel again, warning them against wasting time on baseless arguments. After gathering opinions, the rector proposed a vote. Professors were to raise their hands if they supported placing Desir in Alpha. The atmosphere grew tense as they prepared to decide. Outside, sunlight bathed the Academy's buildings. A list on the announcement board revealed the names of students admitted to the Alpha class. Amid the crowd, one student congratulated another, remarking that her family background guaranteed her success. Beside another board, the Beta class list drew attention from students with fewer connections. One voiced acceptance, saying entry alone was fortunate enough. Yet disappointment lingered among those gathered. Desir stood calmly, hands by his sides, gazing at the list. His name appeared among the Beta students, just as he expected. He crossed his arms and turned his gaze thoughtfully. The entrance exam had ended, and his next steps would soon begin. Romantica appeared beside him, commanding the Beta students to move aside. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she scanned the list. Desir's name stood beside her own. Clenching her fists, she bent forward slightly, stunned by the unexpected outcome. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long streaks of light across the dim hallway of Hebrion Academy. Within one of the classrooms, students sat quietly, facing forward as the lecture began. Romantica scanned the room with a dissatisfied expression. The classroom felt like it had been abandoned for years. Dust clung to the windows, and cobwebs drooped from the ceiling corners. A thick musty odor lingered in the air. Her nose wrinkled at the overwhelming scent of decay. Romantica sighed heavily, lowering her shoulders. Her lips parted in exasperation, and her eyes narrowed with silent dismay. She clenched her teeth, her frustration intensifying. It was hard to believe this was the environment designated for Beta-class students. She found it degrading. Even for a Beta class, this level of neglect was unacceptable. At the front of the classroom, Desir stood with his back to the students, writing on the board. Romantica studied him closely, unimpressed by both the condition of the room and the lack of meaningful content in the lecture. She had never heard of Desir before, and nothing about his current role gave her any reason to believe he belonged at the academy, let alone as someone conducting lessons. Slumping forward, she rested her head on the desk and chewed the tip of her pencil, lost in bitter thoughts about her recent exam. She suspected this miserable situation was punishment for her earlier failure. Desir, seated at his desk, scribbled quietly in a notebook. His expression remained calm and collected, in stark contrast to Romantica's growing irritation. She clenched her fists on her desk and leaned forward, unable to understand why she, a noble, had been placed in the same class as someone like him. Her lips tightened as she glared at him, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He seemed entirely unbothered, as though the dusty surroundings and poor facilities didn't concern him at all. Images of Ajest surfaced in Romantica's mind. She still couldn't comprehend how Desir had defeated a magical swordsman like her. That kind of feat should have earned him a place among the alpha students. Narrowing her eyes, she glared at Desir with growing resentment. Regardless of how much she disliked him, his skills couldn't be dismissed. She kept her eyes fixed on him, her expression sharp, until Desir, sensing her gaze, turned slightly and gave a small smile. Fury surged in Romantica. She began pounding her fists on the desk. The noise startled the classroom. Desir turned to face her with a composed demeanor. Romantica, trembling with pain, raised her reddened hand. Desir stared straight ahead, thinking bitterly about the way commoners, regardless of talent, were funneled into the beta class. Nothing had changed. The structure of the academy remained broken. Holding a green-lettered document, Desir recalled how many promising students had perished under this flawed system. If the hierarchy didn't exist, the beta class could thrive. Many more would have survived. He vowed not to let history repeat itself. Still seated, Desir imagined himself standing alone on a cliff, surrounded by symbols marked A and B beneath his feet. He resolved to gather as many talented students as possible from the beta class and raise them to the level of alpha. Meanwhile, Romantica rested her head on the desk, lips curled in a frustrated pout. Though the room had nearly emptied, she remained still. Her eyes fluttered closed, eyebrows pinched together. Lying across the table, she lamented her placement once more. This wasn't where she belonged. As she opened her eyes slowly, a figure approached. A gray-haired student stepped into the classroom. He stopped in front of Romantica and asked if she was the daughter of Baron Eru. She raised her head slightly, squinting at him, confused by his sudden presence. More students followed behind him. They stood beside the gray-haired boy, glaring at her. One of them barked that she was being insolent and demanded she stand. Before they could act further, the gray-haired student raised his hand, halting them. He placed a hand on his chest and bowed respectfully. He introduced himself as Danetta Hadun, a fellow first-year student. He explained that he was assembling a group and expressed regret that a noble like her had been cast into the beta class. Romantica remained still, her eyes fixed on Danetta without reacting. She replied coolly, hoping he would find suitable members for his group elsewhere. Danetta responded with a wide grin, revealing his teeth. He stated that he was here for precisely that reason. She raised her head slowly, meeting his gaze with indifference, and asked what he wanted from her. Several beta class students watched the interaction with confusion. It was unusual for alpha class students to visit them. Desir, observing from the hallway, leaned slightly to catch sight of what was unfolding inside the room. Danetta and his group stood firmly in front of Romantica, who remained seated at her desk. Desir noted to himself that Danetta had already begun taking action. A folded note peeked from Desir's pocket as he continued to observe. Danetta furrowed his brows and pinched his nose with visible distaste. He declared his disappointment in the academy for allowing nobles to waste away in such unworthy surroundings. The beta students turned away, expressions heavy with shame. Danetta looked down on them with scorn, stating bluntly that Romantica had been left to rot among commoners. Romantica's eyes closed for a moment. She responded with a tight smile, asking Danetta what he meant. Her grin held a sharp edge. Desir watched intently, expression unreadable. The classroom fell silent, tension mounting. Danetta got to the point. Extending his hand, he explained that he was part of the Blue Moon group, led by Elheim. He invited Romantica to join, claiming that her abilities were more than worthy of their elite team. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. This sort of offer was rare. Danetta smiled with a hint of arrogance, raising his palm as he spoke. According to him, Blue Moon was the most prestigious group in Hebrion Academy. With Professor Fergman at the helm and its members clad in blue robes and hoods, the group represented the pinnacle of alpha-class potential. Romantica pursed her lips and looked away, her gaze sharp and burning. She considered the opportunity. If Ajest was part of Blue Moon, then joining it might be the only way to leave Beta behind. Her hands clenched into fists as she weighed the offer. The choice seemed obvious. However, Danetta leaned forward, placing one hand on the desk. Desir continued watching with a stern expression. Danetta reached out and took Romantica's hand. With a smirk, he stated the condition. in return for recommending her to the group, she would become his girlfriend. Romantica's face froze in disbelief. Her lips parted slightly as she stared at him. The class watched in stunned silence. The hallway buzzed with voices as students wandered through during recess. Inside the classroom, Romantica found herself in an awkward exchange. Donetta, with a faint grin, had just repeated his unexpected proposal. He declared, with confidence, that Romantica would become his girlfriend. She blinked in confusion, unsure if she had heard correctly. Donetta clarified that they had met once before. He explained that during a ceremonial event before the entrance exam, he had fallen for her at first sight. Romantica pulled her hand away, her cheeks tinged with red. With uncertainty in her expression, she lowered her gaze and clutched her chest, asking him for time to think. Donetta smiled broadly and gestured with both hands, assuring her that, as a gentleman, he would give her the time she requested. Leaning over a desk, he paused and remarked that he had nearly forgotten something. Then he revealed a small item, which drew Romantica's surprised gaze. Held in his hand was an ornate wooden dagger with a white surface. He explained that in his kingdom, it was traditional to give such a dagger to someone they admired. Rotating the dagger, he turned the hilt toward Romantica and pointed to the handle. There, hidden inside, was a gift. Donetta lifted the handle and revealed a gold chain, its surface gleaming in the light. Romantica stared at the chain, stunned by the gesture. Holding it between his fingers, Donetta asked her to accept it as a sign of his sincere intentions. She hesitated, hands raised in disbelief, and told him it was too much. Without waiting for protest, Donetta placed the chain into her palm, assuring her again that there was no rush. Then he turned and began leaving the classroom, his group pushing aside the beta class students who stood in his path. Romantica remained behind, eyes fixed on the gold chain resting in her hand. Her expression tightened with uncertainty as she narrowed her eyes at the gift. Suddenly, a familiar silhouette cast a shadow over her desk. Desir had approached without a sound, his tone laced with mischief as he remarked on how popular she seemed to be. Startled, Romantica jerked back and flung the chain into the air. Her hands shot upward in surprise. Several beta students turned to look, just as she toppled from her chair and hit the ground. Rubbing her head, she stared up in frustration. Desir leaned slightly forward, eyes closed with a small smirk playing on his lips. He teased her for reacting so dramatically to his presence. Romantica glared at him, clearly annoyed, and snapped that he had only startled her. Desir, unfazed, offered to help her up. Embarrassed, Romantica flushed and declared that she could handle it herself. She stood up, righted her chair, and sat down while Desir observed her calmly. Romantica then demanded to know what he wanted from her. Her expression grew tense as she clenched her teeth. Desir stared back with a serious look, bearing a hint of teeth as he spoke. He said he had come to make the same offer Donetta had. Romantica froze, arms wrapping around herself, and accused him of suggesting a relationship. Desir shook his head and clarified that she misunderstood. Romantica groaned in frustration, dropped her head onto the desk, and asked him to stop dancing around the topic. She made it clear that she wasn't in the mood for games. Desir remained composed, his eyes blank, his lips slightly parted. He calmly asked what was troubling her. Romantica lifted her head and met his gaze, her face tight with irritation. Slowly, she raised her hand, revealing the gold chain once again. Desir's eyes widened in confusion as she clenched the chain tightly in her fist. She asked him, with clear frustration, whether if he were in her shoes, he would accept the offer of someone from the prestigious Alpha class or choose an unknown team led by a member of the Beta class. Desir looked at her with pursed lips, unable to answer. Romantica stretched her arms across the desk, resting her chin on the surface. Her words carried weight. Joining the Alpha class almost guaranteed success, while remaining in Beta meant risking everything under someone with no standing or reputation. Desir narrowed his eyes and frowned. He knew she had already made her decision. Changing it would be difficult. From her posture and tone, it was clear that she believed selecting Alpha was the only rational choice. Desir viewed it as the worst decision she could possibly make. Lifting his arms slightly, Desir looked up at the ceiling. Romantica waved him off, implying that he had little hope of persuading her. He quietly acknowledged that fact. Then he reached into his pocket and retrieved a small envelope. Romantica stared at him, puzzled by what he wanted her to see. He placed the envelope gently on her desk. She picked it up, examining it with skepticism. The sight of the envelope surprised her, it seemed so outdated. No one sent handwritten letters anymore. Desir raised his hand to his face while Romantica looked between him and the envelope. He told her that if she truly didn't care about what was inside, she could simply throw it away. His tone remained indifferent. He said nothing more, only adding that the letter contained something personal. A secret. Romantica's eyes widened. She quickly tore open the envelope and lowered her head, reading the contents in silence. Her expression darkened. Crumpling the letter in her hand, she trembled. Desir remained motionless, eyes cool and unfazed. He asked her again whether she was now ready to have a real conversation. Romantica slammed her palms on the desk and stood up sharply. Her sudden movement drew the attention of their classmates, though none understood what had just happened. Desir met her gaze with a piercing stare. His voice remained calm as he urged her not to cause a scene, insisting that he had no desire to expose her secret to anyone else. Romantica lowered her head and mumbled, still confused about how he had discovered something so personal. Sunlight from the window glinted on the ceiling above them. Desir reminded her that he had no obligation to explain. Romantica gripped the letter tighter, her knuckles white against the paper. She leaned against the desk, overwhelmed. Desir finally spoke again, saying that she already knew the real reason for her current situation. He didn't need to elaborate. Romantica's expression twisted with anger. She bared her teeth and pressed her palms to the desk. Desir's final words made it clear. She was placed in the beta class for a reason, and deep down, she understood exactly what that reason was. The afternoon sun bathed the campus of Hebrion Academy in soft warmth as Romantica stared furiously at Desir. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, followed him as he slightly tilted his head and suggested they continue their conversation elsewhere. The classroom was too crowded for privacy, and he believed speaking outside would be more comfortable. Romantica placed her hands on the desk and let out a heavy sigh before silently agreeing. The two stepped outside, where the sunlight filtered gently through the thick canopy of trees surrounding the academy. They found a quiet corner near the building, and Romantica stood across from Desir, her expression guarded. She asked if he had spoken to anyone about her circumstances. Desir assured her that he had told no one. However, most professors already knew the truth. Desir looked away while Romantica sat down, lowering her head. He added that her placement in the beta class was tied to this knowledge. Her face hardened as she turned sharply toward him, demanding an explanation. She insisted that the academy was far from the kingdom of Prelecha, so her past should not have been known. Desir calmly explained that she underestimated Hebrion Academy's reach. The academy conducted deep background checks on all students. Her family, once wealthy merchants, had gained a noble title by purchasing it from a poor baron when she was just a child. This act branded her as a commoner despite the title. Romantica glared at Desir, confused about how he knew so much. Desir met her gaze steadily. He pointed out that claiming noble status would not erase her common birth. He reminded her that Professor Nefleka, who led the Blue Moon faction, was among those who knew and held contempt for people like her. Romantica's eyes widened in shock. She believed Donetta would shield her, but Desir disagreed. He reminded her of Donetta's disdain for commoners, something she had seen firsthand. The thought unsettled her, and she imagined how Donetta would react if he learned her origins. Desir spread his arms, prompting her for a decision. Romantica, still fuming, accused him of trying to force her into his group. Desir paused, rubbed his chin, and acknowledged her concern. He then proposed a compromise. She would join his group for 1 month. If she found it unbearable, she could leave. Romantica narrowed her eyes at the offer. Trusting Desir was difficult, however, when he extended his hand for a handshake, she hesitated. His confident smile made her feel uneasy. Eventually, she accepted, shaking his hand. They exchanged a knowing glance, both aware of their differences. Romantica reminded him that he had annoyed her since the entrance exam. Desir chuckled and admitted he already knew. Their surroundings were serene, framed by towering trees. Romantica sat at a long, empty table, tearing a loaf of bread. Her displeasure showed as she examined the bread's hardness. Desir, seated across from her with folded arms, had already finished his meal. He commented that the food was tolerable and certainly better than orc meat. Romantica recoiled at the thought, trying to play it off as a joke. She dipped her bread into her soup and turned serious again. She pointed out that forming a group would be difficult. With only the two of them, they lacked the numbers. Other groups in the beta class already had strong members and reputations. Attracting new teammates would be tough since no one knew them. Romantica wiped her mouth, frowning at Desir. She challenged him to provide a solution. Desir closed his eyes, smiled, and remained calm. Romantica noted his quiet confidence and grew agitated. She suspected he was enjoying her frustration. Desir responded that initially she had said joining his group was awful. Now, however, she was clearly concerned about its future. This annoyed Romantica even more. She waved her arms and shouted that she only cared because she had to endure an entire month with him. Still amused, Desir continued smiling, which prompted her to throw a spoon at his forehead. Her cheeks puffed with anger, and her fists clenched. Desir reassured her that things would work out. He mentioned a professor who would help and someone he hoped to recruit. Romantica exploded again, yelling that he should have said so earlier. Her voice echoed through the school grounds as they walked together along a path flanked by massive tree trunks. She asked who this potential member was. Desir revealed the name, Pram Schnaizer. They arrived at a large hall filled with platforms where students competed. Desir and Romantica took seats among the crowd. She fidgeted, unable to sit still. Around them, swords of various sizes hung from wooden racks. The table's leg nearby was uneven. Two students from the same club muttered complaints about the poor state of the facility. Desir sat with his arms crossed while Romantica tried to find a clean spot. The discontent around them stemmed from the controversial decision to mix alpha and beta classes. Romantica suddenly remembered they were supposed to find Pram and began scanning the crowd. Desir looked ahead, reminding her who they were searching for. Pram was a swordsman from the beta class, known for surviving 9 years in the shadow world. His talent and perseverance had sharpened his skills beyond most of his peers. With his blue hair, white armor, and long sword, Pram stood out as one of the most gifted students. Desir believed Pram to be unmatched among beta-class swordsmen. Romantica commented that seeing him would be interesting. Just then, Desir spotted Pram walking past. He grinned and alerted Romantica that their target had appeared. Pram began his warm-up, leaning forward with focus. His breathing was steady, and his movements were controlled. His large blue eyes scanned the field as he extended his hand, preparing to demonstrate the strength that had earned Desir's attention. Pram continued stretching his shoulders while Romantica, visibly surprised, failed to understand how such a charming and sweet person had remained unnoticed. Desir watched with a faint smile as Romantica animatedly praised Pram like an idol, admiring every detail about him. Desir remarked that Pram always reminded him of a delicate pearl. Romantica clenched her fists, strongly disagreeing, and claimed Pram's charm far surpassed that comparison. Romantica's mood shifted as she glared at Desir, trembling slightly. She found it baffling that someone so cute had escaped her notice. Pram, caught in the attention, closed his eyes and scratched his nose modestly. Romantica's admiration deepened. She declared that she would adopt him, loudly stating her willingness to sacrifice all her savings if necessary. Desir watched the scene unfold in bewilderment as Romantica continued to fawn over Pram. Meanwhile, Pram stood in front of a weapons rack, carefully examining his options. His expression reflected the difficulty of the choice. Then his gaze fixed on one particular weapon. He reached out and gripped the wooden handle. Both Desir and Romantica stared in disbelief as Pram pulled out an enormous wooden sword. Desir's expression turned puzzled upon realizing that Pram had chosen a two-handed sword. He had always assumed Pram used a rapier. Romantica's eyes widened as well, her curiosity piqued. Desir began to wonder if he had misunderstood something about Pram's fighting style. Shortly afterward, Pram faced a red-haired alpha-class student in the sparring arena. His opponent looked at him with disdain. Pram bowed and introduced himself with formal grace, one hand placed over his chest. The red-haired alpha student responded with arrogance, refusing to give his name to someone he considered a beta-class failure. The referee stood at the edge of the platform and gave the order to prepare for combat. A moment later, the red flag waved, signaling the start of the match. Pram launched forward in anger, attempting to strike with his heavy blade, though his attack was blocked. His opponent snarled and pushed back, repelling the blow and retreating slightly to prepare for a counter. Pram glared at his opponent and resumed his offensive. He swung the large sword in a flurry of rapid and heavy strikes. His opponent defended each one with skill but began to struggle under the pressure. Eventually, Pram landed a solid hit, sending the alpha-class student flying backward. The blow left a visible trail of damage across the ground. Desir, observing from a distance, noted how Pram wielded the sword without hesitation. Yet he also realized that such attacks would have been far easier to control with a rapier. The alpha-class student tensed, readying for retaliation. He charged forward, sword raised in fury. Pram tried to respond, adjusting his stance, but showed slight hesitation. The red-haired opponent closed in and attempted to break through Pram's defense. Pram held his massive sword in front of him to block the blow. However, the Alpha-class student maintained pressure and launched another furious set of attacks. Pram struggled to dodge, closing his eyes tightly to withstand the barrage. As the Alpha-class fighter prepared another strike, Pram waited patiently for an opening. When the moment came, he stomped forward to reposition himself for a counter. Yet his opponent, with a sharp grin, anticipated the move. Pram leaned in for a low strike, trying to sneak beneath the guard. His eyes widened in shock when he realized his swing had missed. The Alpha-class student noticed the flaw in Pram's form and seized the opportunity. He slashed at Pram's exposed arm. The massive blade flew from Pram's grasp. Pram collapsed to the ground, clutching his injured arm. His eyes shifted toward the fallen weapon, then lowered in silent acceptance of defeat. His opponent, still confused by what had just happened, watched as Pram slowly got back to his feet, pain evident in his movements. Romantica turned to Desir and questioned how Pram, who was supposed to be skilled, had made such mistakes. Desir replied with quiet disappointment. Pram's reckless movements drained his stamina too quickly, and even novices avoided such obvious errors. Desir's expression held a touch of fatigue as he observed Pram, mirroring Romantica's growing disappointment. Despite Pram's sweet and gentle appearance, his lack of sword skill had become apparent. Romantica suggested they might need to consider another candidate. Desir examined Pram more closely, trying to understand the reason behind the failure. Pram glanced sideways, his face marked by shame. A moment later, he turned back to face his opponent again. Romantica's eyes widened in surprise as Desir suddenly moved forward from where he had stood. At that moment, the red-haired Alpha-class student glared viciously at Pram and raised his fist, ready to strike again and finish the match. The room grew silent as everyone turned toward Desir's voice. He shouted at the Alpha student to stop attacking Pram. Despite Desir's protest, the Alpha student delivered another heavy punch to Pram's face. Pram winced, curling up as the Alpha student stood over him, raining down blows without pause. Desir approached the ring, his expression tight with anger. He demanded to know why the attack continued. The Alpha student dismissed the question, sneering at the Beta class and calling them beneath his notice. Straightening his collar with a bruised hand, he expressed disgust at having to engage with anyone from their level. Desir moved closer as Pram remained collapsed on the ground. He reminded the Alpha student that this behavior was inexcusable. As Desir knelt beside Pram, the Alpha student drew his sword and warned Desir to step back unless he wanted the same treatment. Desir asked what could drive someone to such cruelty. Pram stirred, his breathing labored, one hand pressed to his cheek. Desir, seeing his condition, stated that the Alpha student lacked any honor. In response, the Alpha student lowered his sword and gazed at the Beta class with contempt. Desir calmly explained that the Alpha student's pride had been wounded, forced to exert himself against a Beta class student. The Alpha student's eyes narrowed in fury, his grip tightening around the hilt of his sword. Desir looked up, unflinching, as the Alpha student swung his blade once more, aiming for Pram's head. Pram squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for impact. Instead, a splatter of blood touched his face. He opened his eyes slightly to find Desir standing over him, arm outstretched, blood dripping from a deep wound. The Alpha student stared at his broken sword in disbelief. Pram's eyes widened as he realized Desir had taken the blow to shield him. Desir kept his arm raised. The Alpha student stammered in confusion, trying to understand how Desir had intercepted the strike. Calmly, Desir reminded him that the sparring match had ended. There was no justification for this assault. The Alpha student looked into Desir's determined expression and faltered. For a brief moment, a childhood memory flashed in his mind, a time when he stood before his white-haired master, trying to justify his actions against a commoner. The memory ended with the master's eyes filled with anger and disappointment. The Alpha student turned away from the ring, stating that he was finished. Desir sat down, calling after him that he was fortunate no professor had witnessed the event. The Alpha student scoffed and shouted over his shoulder, telling Desir to save his lectures. Romantica and Pram rushed to Desir's side. Both were visibly shaken by what had occurred. Desir offered them a soft smile, though his injury was severe. They watched him with anxious eyes, unsure how to respond. Sunlight streamed through the windows of a tall building with a blue roof. Inside, they sat in a large office. Pram carefully wrapped Desir's wounded hand while Romantica lounged nearby. She asked why he had involved himself in the fight. Pram also looked concerned, asking if Desir was in pain. Romantica chuckled at Desir's state, teasing him for earning karma after the way he had treated her during the entrance exams. Pram had tied a small bow on the bandage, which Desir lifted to examine with a quiet grin. Pram lowered his head, apologizing. Desir reassured him, reminding Pram that the decision to interfere had been his own. Pram blamed himself, believing his actions had brought trouble. Desir explained that he had understood the consequences and still chose to act. Romantica and Desir watched Pram closely. His expression slowly shifted from regret to determination. Romantica found his reaction endearing. A medicine box sat on the table nearby as Pram finally lifted his gaze and smiled. Realizing they hadn't introduced themselves properly, Pram offered his name first. Desir and Romantica returned the gesture, their smiles easing the tension. Pram turned again to Desir, asking him to drop formalities. Desir asked if Mr. Pram was acceptable, which made Pram flustered. He insisted on using only his name, clearly uncomfortable with anything too formal. Desir and Romantica chuckled at his embarrassment. Desir understood why Pram reacted that way and smiled. Time passed. A gold clock on the wall signaled it was getting late. The three prepared to leave and stepped into the spacious corridor of the academy. Desir turned to Pram, encouraging him once more to speak casually. Since they were the same age, it felt natural. Pram responded with a humble bow, insisting on maintaining respect. He expressed deep gratitude for Desir's intervention, promising to repay him whenever needed. Desir, amused, asked if that meant he could call on him for anything. Pram nodded with joy and pledged his help without hesitation. Desir extended an invitation for Pram to join his group. Overjoyed, Pram immediately accepted. Desir, still smiling, warned that their group wasn't the best. Pram didn't care. His eyes gleamed with admiration as he accepted the offer, standing proudly beside his new teammates. A slightly clouded sun cast soft light over a white building with a blue roof and matching accents. Rays streamed through the windows, brightly illuminating the corridors. Near one of the rooms, 3 students stood gathered: Desir, Romantica, and Pram. Desir reassured them that the meeting had been arranged. Inside the room, Professor Bridget turned her head towards the door, surprised by the interruption. Desir stepped inside. To his right, a dining area with red sofas and cups of tea on the table invited comfort. On the left, a cabinet held a vase with a neatly arranged plant. He offered a polite apology for the intrusion. Romantica grew curious about the person behind Desir. Near Pram, she and the boy glanced toward a woman in a red dress. Desir, eyes closed for a moment, commented on how long it had been. Before him stood Professor Bridget, her short hair styled neatly, her red dress elegant with cutouts along the hips, revealing slender legs wrapped in black stockings and heels. She acknowledged Desir's words and welcomed the guests. Romantica admired Brigitta's beauty, while Pram shyly hid behind Desir. Bridget noticed the injury on Desir's hand, though he dismissed it casually. White cups with golden rims waited on the table, filled with tea. Bridget poured for her guests, inviting them to sit. Desir expressed gratitude for the reception. Bridget remarked on Desir's surprising performance during the entrance exam, confessing she had never seen such magical skill from him. He laughed nervously, scratching the back of his head, unsure if he had truly done so well. She placed a brimming cup on a saucer and explained that it was the first time he had demonstrated such ability, especially against Ajest Kingscrown, a powerful contender. Although visibly flustered, Desir attempted to downplay the praise, only to be reminded that he had achieved a significant victory. Romantica, enthusiastic about the tea, found it exceptionally delicious. Bridget recalled how Desir once claimed he would never reach this level, her amused grin leaving him even more embarrassed. Bridget closed her eyes, her hand resting against her cheek as she feigned being wounded by his surprise. Desir began to sweat, wilting under the pressure of her words. With a laugh, Bridget dismissed the moment and encouraged everyone to drink before the tea grew cold, noting how hard it was to obtain the leaves. Romantica pressed a fist to her mouth in amusement while Desir glared at her in mild frustration. Seated beside Pram, he accepted a fresh cup of tea. Bridget smiled, expressing her happiness at Desir's progress. The atmosphere shifted as she questioned his intention to form his own group. His eyes lit up, he responded with determination, revealing his goal of reaching alpha class through a qualified exam. Bridget considered this while steam rose from her cup. Her gaze narrowed as she asked if he understood the difficulty involved. Desir confirmed his awareness. Folding his hands at chest level, he met her confident smile. Pram, curious, asked what she meant about the Alpha class transfer. Bridget explained the Academy's promotion system. An exam selected 30 students to enter the 5th level Shadow world. There, they performed various tasks, and the top 9 earned the title of first rank. Success in this trial could allow a beta class student to transfer to Alpha. However, she emphasized that Desir's goal was not just promotion. He aimed to reach the top 9 and earn the title. Romantica and Pram listened attentively. Rising from her seat, Bridget asked for confirmation. Desir furrowed his brows and gave a firm response. Romantica, shocked, stood and voiced her disbelief. To her, reaching the top 30 already seemed impossible, especially for beta students who faced constant sabotage. Desir met her gaze silently, while Pram looked on with concern. Attention returned to Bridget, who acknowledged Romantica's point. She clarified that most candidates would come from Alpha class, composed of elite groups. Pram added that beta students would likely be targeted simply because of their status. Bridget agreed. She repeated that they would become targets for all Alpha students. Desir proposed that this was precisely why they needed someone among the first rank. Romantica corrected him, saying he should be that person. With a sigh, she returned to her seat as Pram watched her silently. Bridget raised an eyebrow, sensing the implication. Desir offered his hypothesis. If a beta group reached the end with only 3 members, the Academy would be forced to recognize the flaws in its system. Bridget grew tense, repeating the dismissive phrase often used as an excuse. Her eyes shifted to the cup of tea now cooling beside the teapot. Desir insisted this would expose the system's inequality. Bridget closed her eyes, thinking deeply. After a moment, she gave approval for Desir to form a group, though with one condition. Her eyes gleamed as she turned to him, stating she needed to confirm something first. She addressed Romantica, who met her gaze. Then she called Pram by name. Bridget asked both of them if, after hearing everything Desir had shared, they still wished to join his group. Bright sunlight poured through the trees, casting rays onto the wide path where a towering statue of blue light gleamed beneath the clear sky. This was Hebrion Academy, a prestigious training center. Within its grounds, students engaged in mock battles. Not far from the physical arena stood a virtual simulation space, where trainees fled from massive magical explosions. Romantica followed her friends through the corridors, glancing around in awe. She called the place incredible and wished they were granted access to such high-level training grounds. Above their heads, a large sign displayed the word Alpha. Romantica expressed her frustration, envious of those privileged enough to train in such areas. She added that if she ever got permission to train there, she would come to love the academy completely. They made their way to the top floor of the training center. Upon arrival, Romantica surveyed their designated training room with disbelief. Instead of a proper facility, they were met with a dusty, abandoned attic. She could hardly believe Desir intended to use such a place. Desir, however, maintained that while it appeared unimpressive, the location had potential. Suddenly, something darted past Pram. Romantica instinctively covered her mouth in panic, her eyes wide with fear before letting out a loud scream. All eyes turned toward her. One of the students asked what had happened. Pram leapt back, pulling one leg toward himself, shouting that something was there. Desir remarked that it was likely just a rat. Romantica looked horrified. Her body trembled as she lowered her head, and sweat trickled down her face. Desir, sensing the atmosphere shift, pushed her forward. Romantica, startled, tried to escape, but Desir swiftly shut the door behind her. He placed his hand on the switch. Romantica shrieked that the rats would attack her while the others attempted to calm her down. At that moment, a stone in the room began to glow. Magic stones embedded around the space lit up as well. Desir noted that this setup would be much better for training, though Romantica appeared to be on the verge of losing control. The 3 of them stood at the entrance. Desir tried to lift their spirits, but his words were cut short when the lights abruptly shut off. Dozens of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, staring directly at them. Romantica gasped in terror, frozen in place, while Pram and Desir behind her tensed up. As a swarm of rats surged toward them, Romantica squealed. Desir held Pram firmly, shielding him. Romantica clung tightly to Desir, wrapping her arms around his neck in panic. He also supported Pram at the same time. Desir looked at Romantica, who shouted in protest. He sighed, wondering aloud how long she intended to keep holding on. Then he examined the glowing stone overhead. Romantica's eyes widened in anticipation as he admitted they had left him no other option. Her expression softened, tears welling in her eyes, and she asked if they were finally leaving the attic. Instead of agreeing, Desir told her to clean the floor while he sealed the holes. Romantica exploded with outrage, demanding if he wanted her to die there. Desir grinned, declaring he intended to make the most of this space. Romantica raised an eyebrow, baffled by his response. Pram, still recovering, sat near the attic window, slouched on the stairs. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath and understand where he was. Slowly, he stood and surveyed his surroundings. At that moment, Desir greeted him cheerfully. Romantica remained seated in a chair, visibly annoyed. Desir informed Pram that the cleaning was already complete. Pram, clearly upset, questioned how that could have happened so quickly, especially since he had an injured hand. His concern was genuine. He clenched his fists and asked why they always acted this way toward him, his voice shaking with frustration. It seemed he was close to tears. Desir offered a calm apology, then stood and urged him to move on to the next task. Romantica muttered complaints under her breath. Desir turned away, satisfied, and announced it was time for training to begin. Romantica recalled sipping a warm cup of tea and remembered Bridget, the professor who had asked if she was prepared to join Desir's group. Now seated in silence, she reflected on how absurd the idea seemed. Many talented individuals at the academy could outperform her. As a second circle magician, she understood her chances of reaching the top 9 were slim. Her thoughts returned to Desir, whose confident demeanor remained vivid in her mind. She leaned sideways, exasperated by how much he irritated her. Still, she remembered his smug expression during their meeting. Realization dawned that she had officially joined his group. Sunlight illuminated the academy's grand facade. Romantica covered her face with her hand, already regretting her decision. Nearby, Desir looked at her calmly. Romantica announced the start of training with newfound determination. She turned to Desir with resolve, expressing her willingness to follow his lead, regardless of how outrageous his plans seemed. In the newly opened training room, Desir discussed how they could use the spacious area beyond the adjacent door for both practice and office work. While rummaging through a drawer, he located what he had been looking for and stood upright. Romantica asked what he had found. Desir pulled out a small orb and explained they would use it for training. He handed it to her and told her to focus on improving her spell casting speed. Romantica rolled her eyes, stating that her casting speed was already fast. She pointed out that Desir should have noticed this during the entrance exam. Desir looked at her and acknowledged her claim. He shrugged and agreed her speed was impressive. However, he added that it was only above average for regular magicians. Compared to alpha-class students, her speed lagged behind significantly. He warned her that she would eventually face such opponents. Even if her skills were slightly inferior, overcoming that gap would be difficult. Romantica began to sweat, questioning whether Desir truly believed she could improve in such a short time. He nodded and held the orb close to her face, asserting that this would be the key to her progress. With a serious tone, he instructed her to use it for non-verbal spellcasting, starting immediately. Surprised, Romantica stared at him, confused by the idea of using spells without speaking. Desir smiled and calmly explained that it was indeed possible, although she was not yet able to perceive it. Normally, spells activate only after they are chanted, but non-verbal casting bypasses this delay. With proper control, she could activate a spell instantly. Romantica held her face in frustration and commented that such a thing only existed in theory. Desir, turning his back to her, rejected that notion. In his mind, he recalled someone who had mastered it. It was Romantica herself, in the distant future. When he turned to face her again and saw her doubtful expression, he challenged her resolve. If she refused to believe him, she might as well chew her stone-hard bread. Romantica, regaining her composure, asked what she needed to do. Desir responded by taking a piece of chalk and drawing a circle on the floor around her. She watched in confusion. He then directed her attention to another circle across the room. She accepted the orb and looked at Desir, seeking clarification. He pointed toward the second circle and instructed her to move the orb there, without throwing it. She had to do it as a magician. Her eyes widened. Desir elaborated that she must manipulate the airflow around the orb to move it, without physical contact. She nodded, determined to try. Sitting beside the orb, she began to think deeply about how to channel airflow. She likened it to a person attempting to fly with wings, an elusive sensation for most. Romantica's eyes grew focused as she poured all her effort into controlling the wind. She told herself she would master the technique. Once she succeeded, she would be able to cast any first circle spell silently. Desir reminded her that simply staring at the orb would not be enough. Romantica snapped back that she already knew that. As Desir referenced a moment when she used magic during cleaning, Romantica's eyes lit up. She recalled how objects used to move on their own when they obstructed her path. She defended herself by saying those items had been too heavy. Desir raised his finger, pointing out that she had subconsciously used magic because she wanted to move them. He believed she had felt some kind of movement in the wind. Romantica remembered with concern how Desir had scolded her for making a mess. Now, encouraged, she promised to try. She placed her hands near the orb and focused on directing the wind. Her eyes widened as she visualized the movement. Determined, she began to envelop the orb in wind energy. Eventually, her self-hypnosis started working and the orb shifted slightly. Desir praised her progress and urged her to continue. She grinned slyly, pleased by his approval. Suddenly, Desir turned toward Pram, who had been sitting quietly on a box. Hearing his name, Pram jolted. With hopeful eyes, he asked if it was now his turn. Desir scratched his cheek, slightly embarrassed, and admitted he had nothing to teach him. Pram looked surprised and asked why. Desir exhaled and told him that his swordsmanship was already exceptional, more than enough for the upcoming qualifying exam. Pram listened quietly, disappointment crossing his face. Desir added that very few students in the alpha class match his level. Pram, still doubtful, asked if that was true. Desir studied his expression closely and reflected on it. In Desir's thoughts, he considered that Pram would perform far better with a rapier than a two-handed sword. He remembered how Pram had always led attacks wielding his shining rapier, his skill placing him among the few who survived the harshest trials. Desir then asked Pram a direct question. With a concerned expression, he wanted to know why Pram no longer used a rapier. The boy looked hesitant and fearful, as though he had long dreaded this moment. Desir's gaze was firm and expected a real answer. Pram dropped his head and quietly asked how Desir had discovered his past. He was embarrassed and clearly reluctant to speak about it. Shaking slightly, Pram held his knees, listening to Desir explain that their group's strength depended on this knowledge. It was necessary. After a brief pause, Pram released his knees and spoke. He invited Desir to step outside with him. The conversation continued as they moved through the room, nearing the exit. Pram glanced at Desir and hesitated. He wondered aloud if it was right to leave Romantica behind. Desir, however, did not share his concern. He explained that Romantica was likely focused on her results and determined to reach her goal. She was not in danger, at least not from anything immediate. Pram smiled slightly, but as they approached the doorway, his expression changed. Slowing his steps, he turned timidly to Desir. What he said next caught Desir off guard. Pram had never seen his father. To avoid eye contact, Pram turned away and began recounting his story. His mother had been a commoner, and his father an aristocrat. As Pram looked out the window, where the last rays of the sun stretched across the sky, he revealed that he was an illegitimate child. He wanted to show Desir the only thing his father had left behind. Without waiting for a reply, Pram ran off. Desir remained seated on a large sofa, gazing out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. Moments passed before Pram returned, holding something in his hand. He asked if Desir had been waiting long. When Desir turned to face him, he was stunned. In Pram's hands rested a long, elegant rapier. Pram began pulling it from its sheath, explaining that it was the very weapon his father had left him. Desir stepped forward with curiosity, asking to take a closer look. Pram handed it over. As Desir held the rapier, his eyes widened. Sweat trickled down his face. The weapon was surprisingly light for its length, which struck him as unusual. Despite its build, it seemed unlikely to inflict real damage. Bringing it closer, he noticed an inscription engraved on the hilt. The detail intrigued him. Pram sat across from Desir and continued his story. He was around 6 years old when he discovered the rapier. Hanging his head, he explained that he had always believed the sword was a token left for him by his absent father. Since then, he had devoted himself to training with it, determined to master the blade. In his heart, he dreamed of meeting the man who left it behind, hoping one day to earn his pride. While he trained daily, his mother watched from a distance. Her eyes often welled with tears. One day, after finishing his exercises, he sat beside her. She told him never to seek out his father. Their lives belonged to separate worlds. She insisted he should never try to cross into the one that had abandoned them. With a trembling voice, Pram recalled how her warm hand cupped his cheek. She reassured him, telling him not to be disheartened. With tear-filled eyes, she confessed that she loved him deeply and always would. The boy cried silently beside her bed, moved by her words. Shortly after, she took her final breath, and he was left weeping alone. Even in her final moments, she never revealed the name of his father. Listening intently, Desir began to understand. For a noble family, an illegitimate child brought shame. Imagining the consequences if Pram had gone in search of his father, Desir realized the boy would never have been allowed into the academy. In his mind, he pictured Pram's mother embracing her son, shielding him even after her death. Desir looked at Pram, his expression filled with sympathy. Suddenly, Pram lifted his head and confessed that, despite his mother's wishes, he wanted to uncover the truth. He had enrolled at the academy for this purpose. With nobles from across the country gathered there, he believed he might find a clue about his father's identity. Gesturing to the rapier now resting on the table, Pram explained that it was his only lead. He had examined the weapon closely and concluded that it was nothing more than a cheap iron blade. Frustration surfaced in his voice. The only item left behind by his father, the one he and his mother had cherished, was just an ordinary piece of metal. His eyes, red from emotion, burned with anger. He called the rapier a worthless trinket. Overwhelmed, Pram grabbed the weapon and hurled it across the room. It clattered against the ground, then rolled away with a dull echo. He shouted again, insisting it was nothing of value. Desir watched silently as the rapier came to a stop. Tears streamed down Pram's face. He had held on to hope, clinging to the belief that the blade meant something. Gripping his shirt tightly, he collapsed to his knees, sobbing for his mother. Desir stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to the scene unfolding before him. His eyes drifted to the rapier lying in the distance. Night had fully fallen, and the stars scattered across the dark sky. Sitting on a bench outside, Desir reflected on everything he had learned. He had not realized the weight Pram had carried alone. Crossing his arms and closing his eyes, Desir considered how he might help. A memory from his past surfaced. He had fought someone armed with a rapier before. Nothing about that battle had changed in this life either. Staring up at the stars, Desir wondered whether Pram might one day wield the blade again. His gaze shifted. Something about the weapon stayed with him. There was familiarity in its form, something etched deep in his memory. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became. He had seen that rapier once before in his past life. Morning arrived with a loud, sudden scream echoing through the house. Desir burst into the room, shouting frantically and demanding to know where Pram had gone. Startled by the commotion, the blue-haired boy froze in place, clutching a wooden sword and unable to respond. Desir then asked Pram if he could examine the rapier once more, wanting a closer look at the weapon. Pram turned away, unwilling to continue the conversation. His frustration was visible, and he dismissed the subject with a few vague gestures. Desir responded with quiet understanding, insisting that he only wished to understand the weapon's nature better. The boy's lips tightened as he stared at the teacher. After a short pause, he confessed that he no longer had the rapier. He had sold it. Later that day, the two of them wandered through the academy's shopping district. Their eyes scanned the counters and stalls, checking everything closely. Desir paused at a swimsuit display and smiled, remembering how often he visited this place in his past life. The memories passed quickly as Pram called his attention, pointing toward a long alley and insisting it was the right direction. Though Desir had never seen the path before, he followed. After walking a short distance, a sign appeared ahead. They now stood before a two-story building. Neither of them moved immediately. A sign on the door clearly stated that the store, Wooju Kane's antique shop, did not offer refunds under any circumstances, not even for damaged items. Desir frowned, realizing the owner must be extremely greedy. No refund policy combined with poor product protection was a clear red flag. Pram broke the silence with a conflicted look on his face. His voice was quiet but firm as he declared he would never use that rapier again. They stepped through the entrance. A narrow hallway lit by an unnatural glow stretched out before them. At the end stood a large iron door, strange and out of place. The thick metal seemed designed to withstand serious attacks, and Desir concluded the shop owner cared deeply about securing the premises. As they approached, the handle shaped like a sinister, grinning face caught their attention. Desir took hold of it and gave a few hesitant knocks. The door creaked open to reveal a massive figure blocking the entrance. It was a barbarian acting as a guard. The sight surprised Desir, who hadn't expected such a man to be working here. After letting them inside, the main character quickly apologized for entering unannounced. A voice responded, dismissing the need for apologies. The speaker stepped forward. It was an elderly man with wild hair, puffing on a pipe and peering through round glasses. He introduced himself as Wooju-kun. He noted the rise in thievery lately and examined his visitors closely. Upon recognizing Pram, he asked if the boy had returned for another transaction. Pram nodded in confirmation. Wooju-kun then turned to Desir with suspicion, questioning their purpose. Desir calmly explained that they came not to sell but to examine something Pram had sold previously. Wooju-kun scoffed and reminded them of the shop's policy. He raised his glasses with a sneer and warned that no returns were allowed. Desir smirked, confirming that they had read the sign. He clarified that they did not want to return anything but to reclaim it. Loud laughter erupted from the old man. He reached under the table and produced the rapier. As he handed it over, he claimed not to have understood their intentions earlier. He commented on the blade's poor condition, noting its rust and odd proportions. It was too large and light to be a proper rapier. Still smoking his pipe, Wooju-kun admitted it was the first time he had seen something like it. However, he knew it to be a kamuvan, an item typically given by nobles to their loved ones. He inspected the blade again and asked if Pram truly wished to buy it back. Pram nodded. Wooju-kun's expression darkened as he named the price, 40 silver coins. Pram erupted, angry that the owner had failed to mention the weapon's true identity during the original sale. He reminded the man that he had sold it for just 90 bronze coins. Wooju-kun dismissed the protest, explaining that Pram had asked for the value of the rapier, which, at first glance, seemed like ordinary iron. Pram shouted in frustration, accusing the man of deception. Tears welled up in his eyes as he demanded honesty. Wooju-kun snapped that 40 silver coins was already a generous offer. He pointed his pipe at them, adding that if he knew how to unlock the blade's secrets, he would have asked for 80. He then asked Desir whether he was prepared to pay. Without hesitation, silver coins spilled onto the table, their clinks echoing across the room. Desir calmly stated that he would take the weapon. Wooju-kun exhaled smoke with satisfaction, remarking that if he had known Desir would agree so easily, he might have raised the price further. Desir looked down at the floor, stating that Wooju-kun had only proven himself to be a disgrace as a merchant. A few moments later, he handed the item to a stunned Pram. The boy accepted it reluctantly, warning that he still had no intention of using it. Desir advised him to trust him just once. With the rapier now in his hands, Desir gave a final instruction. If Pram noticed a deep groove in the hilt, he should insert his fingernail and press gently. After closely examining the blade, Pram finally noticed a narrow groove etched along its surface. Curious, he questioned whether the weapon was truly what he thought it might be. A soft click followed as he drew the rapier from its case. Instantly, a radiant and piercing light filled the room. Pram tossed the empty case aside and raised the sword overhead, his eyes filled with disbelief. The blade gleamed brilliantly, revealing a hidden quality that stunned him. From a corner of the room, Wooju-kun watched with a mix of confusion and envy. He stared at the shining weapon he had once sold for almost nothing. The boy remained focused on the blade, puzzled by its unnatural lightness. Desir stood beside him, a faint grin appearing on his face as he explained that the rapier had been forged from blancium, a rare and precious material. At the same moment, a man nearby leaned against a table, astonished by what he had just heard. Putting a finger to his lips, he whispered in disbelief, recognizing the significance of the blade. Blancium was known to be stronger than steel, incapable of breaking or wearing out. Swordsmen across the world sought weapons forged from it. Not only was it durable, but it was also exceptionally light, so light that items crafted from it often felt weightless. Desir suggested that this might have been the reason Wooju-kun failed to detect a blade inside the sheath. Pram traced the thin but resilient edge with his fingers, impressed by the craftsmanship. For Desir, the moment felt like déjà vu. This exact rapier had once been the boy's weapon in his previous life. Turning toward Pram, Desir stated that it was time to take the weapon and leave. As they approached the exit, a barbarian suddenly stepped forward, blocking their path. He had been stationed there by Wooju-kun. With a single glance at the owner, Desir quickly realized that the man intended to play dirty. The dealer's face twisted into a greedy sneer as he demanded the return of the rapier. Tears welled up in Pram's eyes as he looked at the towering barbarian, whose weapon now pointed away as though releasing the boy for a moment. Walking alongside Pram, Desir quietly reflected that Wooju-kun was far more selfish than he imagined. The owner snarled, claiming he understood the rapier's true value better than anyone. Desir turned his gaze sharply toward Wooju-kun, eyes cold and calculating. He reminded the man that he had willingly sold them the Kamuvan, and the transaction had been fair. Through the net separating them, Desir declared their deal concluded. Wooju-kun, however, refused to accept it. His gaze remained fixed on the rapier as he muttered that he would never have parted with it had he known it was forged from blancium. With a calm expression, Desir responded that if Pram had known it was a Kamuvan, he never would have agreed to sell it either. Wooju-kun's face contorted with rage, calling Desir a petty fraud. His teeth ground with fury, yet Desir remained unmoved, stating that he had merely repaid deception with the same. Although the barbarian stood behind him, Desir showed no concern. He demanded that Wooju-kun open the door, as he and Pram were leaving. The barbarian turned to his master, awaiting a command. Wooju-kun quietly slid a hand across his neck in a threatening gesture, signaling that they would not leave alive. The barbarian stepped forward and informed them that the owner had ordered them to stay. With his enormous sword resting on his shoulder, he commanded the boy and Desir to remain still. Desir glanced up at the towering figure and remarked that his speech reminded him of a friend named Donape. At that moment, a thunderous strike crashed down above Desir's head. He swiftly dodged the blow. The barbarian blinked in disbelief at the cracked floor where Desir had stood. He was equally surprised by the boy's evasion. From a distance, Desir smirked at the guard's astonishment. Wooju-kun's voice then echoed across the room, commanding the barbarian to kill them both. Hesitating slightly, the barbarian turned toward his master, then nodded in acknowledgement. He lifted his sword and began moving toward Pram. Before he could close the distance, a blade was thrust between them. Pram pointed his rapier at the giant and ordered him to step back. Positioned at Desir's feet, the boy stated that he wished to avoid further conflict, but warned that any attempt to approach would be met without mercy. Both Wooju-kun and the barbarian paused, confused by the boy's bold stance. Desir asked Pram if he was truly ready. The boy answered firmly, though his tone was laced with defiance. Desir's expression changed as he reminded Pram of his promise never to wield the rapier again. The boy began to respond with a nervous laugh. Desir interrupted, stating that for now, he was under his protection. The boy nodded in acknowledgement. As the barbarian advanced with his sword drawn, his expression twisted, and he laughed loudly. Pram told Desir to stand back and not interfere. A split second later, a sharp sound zipped past Pram's ear as strands of his hair were sliced away. He responded instantly, leaping up and delivering a forceful blow. Standing before the barbarian, he raised his weapon, ready to engage. Desir observed from the side, analyzing the boy's stance and form. His movements differed drastically from how one wielded a two-handed weapon. Pram's posture was strong, his control evident. Desir reassured himself that the boy could handle this on his own. Glancing at the barbarian, Desir reflected on how those who relied solely on brute force often troubled skilled swordsmen. However, watching Pram, he realized the boy lacked real combat experience. Doubts began to surface. Despite his strength, the boy could be in danger. Suddenly, the barbarian studied Pram carefully. Something about the boy had changed. At that moment, Pram lunged forward, his eyes filled with intensity and excitement. A grin spread across his face as he embraced the thrill of battle. For an instant, Desir saw a flicker of the version of Pram who had once survived the Shadow Labyrinth. From behind Desir, a loud laugh erupted. The barbarian raised his weapon and pointed at Pram, declaring his intent to crush him completely. Desir chuckled softly to himself, still unaccustomed to the dramatic way barbarians spoke. Baring his teeth in a wide grin, the giant moved forward and called Pram a little warrior. The brutal barbarian charged at Pram with a deafening roar, his massive sword raised high. The echoes of his battle cry filled the entire chamber, yet Pram remained still, facing the oncoming threat without hesitation. The giant warrior began circling, trying to lure him into a trap. However, the blue-haired boy waited for the perfect moment before springing backward. In a blink, his rapier plunged into the monster's exposed back. Blood splattered across the barbarian's face, triggering a wild frenzy. Pram landed cleanly on both feet, having twisted midair in a swift aerial maneuver. As he glanced over his shoulder, he noticed the creature's realization. Pram was both quick and elusive. Again, the boy sprang backward, repeating his movements with increasing precision. Each leap was deliberate, showcasing his agility and control. He spread his legs apart, pointing the bloodied rapier at his opponent. A sharp exhale escaped him, filled with both confidence and defiance. The barbarian watched with a mix of irritation and intrigue. The boy's fencing style, although refined, matched his small frame unexpectedly well. His furious gaze met Pram's gleaming eyes, which shone with exhilaration and a hunger for victory. Without pause, Pram stepped forward, his feet hitting the floor with purpose, then launched himself upward. He attempted to vault over the giant's head to deliver another strike. Landing firmly behind the hulking figure, Pram pressed his assault. His rapier danced with speed, striking at various points around the barbarian's body. However, none of his efforts penetrated deep enough to do real damage. The giant remained unshaken. As Pram locked eyes with him, he realized his opponent couldn't track his movements effectively. Despite the boy's high-speed techniques, his attacks lacked sufficient force. Suddenly, the barbarian's lips curled into a twisted grin. That expression caught Pram off guard. He stared in disbelief as the brute expressed amusement at the ongoing fight. Pram landed on his hands, scanning the man's towering figure as he attempted to recalibrate his approach. Though he had landed countless strikes, the giant's fighting spirit showed no signs of faltering. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy the encounter even more. Pram's arms began to tremble. He hadn't used the rapier in such prolonged combat for a while, and fatigue had begun to erode his precision. Doubt crept into his thoughts as he examined the colossal warrior. Could he actually defeat someone like this? That question lingered for a heartbeat before a new clarity formed in his gaze. He reminded himself of the stakes. In order to escape this place, he had to win. There was no alternative. Recomposing himself, Pram prepared another strike. He whispered a vow of victory in his mind. The barbarian smirked in response and suddenly charged forward again. Pram reacted swiftly, leaping backward just in time. A realization dawned on him: his opponent was beginning to adjust to his speed. If this continued, the upper hand would slip away. He had to end it all with a single decisive blow. While trying to determine the barbarian's weakness, Pram's eyes locked onto a vulnerable spot: his opponent's unguarded back. At that moment, an immense force surged toward the giant. Pram dashed in to exploit the opening, yet the brute turned his head just in time, neutralizing the opportunity. The attack halted. The barbarian's eyes flared with fury. He warned Pram not to overthink during combat. A fraction of a second later, a devastating punch slammed into the boy. The strike hurled Pram backward, his body crashing hard against the ground. Blood poured from his mouth, and his rapier slipped from his grasp. He clutched his throat, trying to breathe, his body trembling. Still, with resolve burning within, he dragged himself forward. Blood and saliva mixed on his lips as he reached for his weapon. Then a shadow loomed behind him. Desir stood still, his fingers clenched into a tight fist. Sweat trickled down his cheek. His expression was severe. The brunette had miscalculated the barbarian's strength, and he knew he could no longer stand aside. He could not allow Pram to suffer another blow. Desir called out with urgency, commanding the boy to stop. However, before he could act further, Pram turned to him with determination. Standing shakily, he reclaimed the rapier and reassured Desir with his weary yet steady eyes. The teacher understood his intent immediately. Pram had chosen to finish what he started. As the boy gripped the weapon, he revealed an inscription on the hilt. Its meaning had always been known to Desir. The boy sensed that too. In silence, Pram asked for his teacher's permission, not with words, but with the unwavering expression in his eyes. He then turned to face his enemy again, weapon raised in gratitude for all that Desir had done for him. The barbarian beckoned Pram forward with a crooked finger. The boy charged without hesitation. Instantly, he noticed the creature preparing another overhead attack. A flash of clarity passed through his mind. He would not let the brute land that strike. As the monstrous fist descended, Pram ducked low and rolled swiftly between the barbarian's legs. Now behind him, he rose with a wild, focused glare and launched a counterattack. However, the barbarian turned quickly, grinning with savage delight. He bared his teeth as he prepared to retaliate. Desir watched the confrontation unfold, astonished by the intensity of the exchange. Another massive blow sliced through the air toward Pram, threatening to split him in two. With all the force he could muster, Desir cried out the boy's name, his voice echoing across the battlefield. The barbarian's expression shifted to one of confusion as he stared at the broken weapon in his grasp. He cast a worried glance at the severed blade, clearly shaken by the sharpness of the attack. Pram had cleanly cut through the enemy's sword in a single stroke, sending the broken piece flying, yet his own silver rapier remained flawless. Desir, observing the scene, looked visibly surprised. He had not anticipated such precision or force from Pram. Reacting swiftly, Pram dodged an incoming swing from another opponent. A mirror-like shield formed in his hand as he gripped his weapon tightly. Turning with practiced motion, he drove a fist directly into the attacker's face. The unexpected blow caused the man to lose a tooth and stumble sideways. Pram held his gaze steady as the man crashed down, his knee slamming against the wooden floor. What followed was disturbing. The man, now reduced to a bloodied mess, began smashing his head against the ground until it splintered beneath him. Covered in abrasions and clearly drained, he finally collapsed into unconsciousness. Desir approached with concern, watching as Pram forced a small smile and assured him that he was unharmed, even though he had barely secured the victory. Sweat rolled down Pram's face as he looked at the battered opponent, realizing the rapier's strength had been the key to overcoming the barbarians. The defeated man remained kneeling, head bowed, while Pram clutched his aching stomach. Desir asked how he felt. Pram admitted he was fine, though breathing remained difficult. Desir turned his head, only to find Woo-Ju-kun glaring at him. The older man, with a green band tied across his forehead, questioned if their skirmish had concluded. Woo-Ju-kun muttered to himself, eyeing the pair. Desir gave Pram a faint smile, signaling that it was time to leave. However, Woo-Ju-kun, with a rough jawline and a sly grin, let out a grim chuckle. As Desir and Pram reached the iron door, they paused. Woo-Ju-kun questioned where they were heading, then revealed that the entrance was crafted from keel iron, an impossibly strong material. Standing beside the observation window, Woo-Ju-kun declared that no one, aside from a monster, possessed the strength to open the door. He warned that they would remain trapped unless they handed over the rapier. Pram glanced at Desir, unsure of how to respond. Desir acknowledged his earlier victory, stating again that they would only leave once reinforcements arrived. Woo-Ju-kun tilted his head, peering down at the two. He claimed that surrendering their weapons would save them from future danger. His golden-rimmed glasses slipped slightly as he finished speaking. In the next moment, the door shattered with a single strike from Pram. Desir turned to Woo-Ju-kun, smiling at the stunned reaction spreading across his face. Mucus trailed from Woo-Ju-kun's twisted nose as he gawked in disbelief. Pram, visibly delighted, informed Desir that the door had opened. Desir agreed it was time to go. Outside, a large blue banner adorned a nearby house, accompanied by colorful flags strung like a garland. City residents turned their heads, puzzled by the sudden noise. Desir, struggling for breath, tried to keep pace as Pram assured him they were no longer being pursued. Realization hit Desir. His stamina had dwindled dangerously low. He exhaled deeply and shifted his gaze toward the rapier still clutched in Pram's hand. The golden patterns on the hilt shimmered faintly. In the bustling market, merchants sold various goods. Pram glanced back awkwardly as Desir observed something quietly. Suddenly, Pram let out a cry of joy. Desir turned and offered him a skewer of food. Flushed with embarrassment, Pram hesitated. His sky-blue eyes met Desir's, who assured him no thanks were necessary. Around them, townspeople engaged in animated conversations while Desir and Pram walked together. A sense of guilt lingered in Desir's thoughts. He knew that by provoking Woo-Ju-kun, he had placed Pram in harm's way. Therefore, he felt unworthy of gratitude. They approached a cheerful vendor holding a kebab. Desir, turning his back slightly, lowered his head and reminded Pram that he had listened to his entire story. Pram froze in astonishment. Desir handed him the skewer, which included beans and meat, and welcomed him as a member of his group. Overwhelmed, Pram began to cry. His grip tightened on the rapier's hilt as memories surged forward. He remembered entering the academy, desperately seeking answers about his father. That hope had gradually faded. Alone, dressed in suspenders and trousers, he once felt completely isolated. Above, a white bird glided beneath the bright blue sky while the city bustled below. A chick slept quietly in a nest on a windowsill. Pram, who once wandered without purpose, now felt the stirrings of something new. As the white bird let out a cry, he clenched his fists. Tears flowed freely from his eyes as he stared at Desir holding the kebab. In that moment, he realized Desir had shown him a path he never thought existed. A feather drifted from the sky, landing near his shoe. In front of him stood Desir, smiling, still offering the kebab. Pram accepted and thanked him. He gazed at the food, eyes bruised, and took a bite. In doing so, he resolved to walk this new path, one that Desir had opened for him. The silver rapier, now adorned with hieroglyphs left by his father, rested in its blue case. Desir silently wished that this young bird, now ready to fly, would never lose his way again. Hidden under a hanging sheet, Desir looked up at the sky as Pram finished the kebab with enthusiasm. The white bird soared higher, shedding feathers that glittered in the sunlight. Pram, once directionless, now carried firm resolve. Meanwhile, sunlight bathed the academy surrounded by spruce trees. In the private dining room of the Alpha class, not a single student remained. Romantica stood alone, arms folded, leaning against a gold-decorated pillar. Students passed by, engaged in lively conversations. Sweat trickled down her cheek as a couple cast curious glances her way. A brunette student asked why Abeta was there. The other assumed Romantica was only watching. She closed her eyes and let out a sigh. As she stood, someone called her name. Donetta approached with a smile, asking how long she had been waiting. The ceiling was painted a serene blue, giving the luxurious restaurant a calm, refined ambiance. Seated by the window, Romantica and Donetta waited as a waitress approached, placing a sizzling steak before them. The meat glistened with barbecue sauce and aromatic herbs. The sight alone made Romantica, already opening her mouth, begin to drool. Across from her, Donetta wore a confident smile as he eyed the meal. Donetta asked if the food in the Alpha class was better, though his attention was clearly on Romantica rather than the meal. He pointed toward her and mentioned that he had long wanted to see her again. Meanwhile, Romantica had already begun devouring her steak, cheeks stuffed and satisfaction evident. Through a mouthful of food, she expressed that she was glad to meet him too. All around the Alpha class dining room, students had gathered and were swiftly attended to by waiters. Donetta, now holding a silver knife, began to cut into his steak. Romantica, already finishing hers, straightened her back when he seemed ready to say something else. As he inquired why she had wanted to meet him, Romantica set her table knife neatly on a napkin beside her plate. Then, without hesitation, she placed a wooden training sword on the table. Donetta nearly choked upon seeing the weapon. Romantica calmly explained that she was returning it. Donetta frowned and brought another bite to his mouth while the wooden sword remained untouched between them. With arms folded defiantly, he appeared insulted, clearly expecting a different reception. Romantica folded her hands atop a beige napkin and clarified that he was the only one who ever saw their bond that way. Donetta exhaled deeply and lowered his head, eyes scanning her face. He speculated that perhaps she was uncomfortable seeing him, yet Romantica assured him this was not the case. His eyes widened in disbelief, asking why she would reject him. Romantica raised her head and revealed that she had joined an unnamed group within the Beta class. Donetta, with brows furrowed and blue eyes fixed on her, questioned her choice again. Smiling faintly, he wondered aloud if she had been coerced. Romantica firmly denied this and explained that the decision was hers alone. At first, she disliked being there. Now, she found enjoyment, especially thanks to the group leader's efforts. Under Desir's guidance, her skills had improved dramatically. Her words left Donetta visibly displeased. Romantica reminded him that while in the Beta class, he had dismissed commoners as trash. He did not understand why she brought this up now. Romantica, wearing a shirt with a yellow collar, raised her voice slightly as she confronted him. The tablecloth bunched unevenly under her elbows as she admitted that she had been born a commoner. Donetta's anger surfaced instantly, veins bulged on his forehead, and his eyes turned pale as he glared at her. Tilting his head, he accused her of lying. He looked down at his hand and argued that if she truly were a commoner, she would have accepted his offer without hesitation. For someone like her, it would have been the only chance to reach Alpha class. Romantica glanced at the tablecloth with a calm smile. She acknowledged that he might be right, but she still could not accept his proposal. Donetta continued to study her with intensity, still searching for the real reason behind her rejection. Romantica lowered her head and explained that the people in her group had treated her kindly. She remembered the laughter and support they offered unconditionally. To them, she had become someone new. Donetta raised his head with clear irritation and pressed his thumb to his forehead before laughing bitterly. Romantica stared blankly at him as he told her to be quiet. Looking down at her, he added that trash like her would never change. A single bead of sweat trailed down her cheek as he confirmed her fears. Romantica turned her gaze toward the white ceiling and calmly explained that she understood the reason why nobles despised commoners. At Hebrion Academy, lineage defined status. Aristocrats feared a repeat of history. She imagined soldiers with weapons, storming forward without mercy. These memories reminded her that nobles had once suppressed a republican uprising led by commoners. She visualized a red planet looming in the sky, symbolizing a changed world. With the rise of shadow worlds, anyone with strength and skill could obtain magic stones. Yet, aristocrats had constructed barriers between themselves and the commoners, relegating them to the beta class. Romantica believed this was a tactic to prevent ordinary people from gaining access to such resources. In her mind, the Sand Palace crumbled to dust, representing the fragile hold the aristocracy had on their power. To her, the nobles were like the fearful residents of that castle, terrified of its inevitable collapse. Donetta closed his eyes and lowered his head. With a sour expression, he asked if Romantica intended to form another Republican group. Smiling faintly, Romantica spread her arms, saying she simply wanted him to understand why nobles still feared commoners after more than 10 years. Donetta's sly smile reappeared. Shocked by the length of time that had passed, he suddenly stood up, startling Romantica. His face reddened with rage as veins pulsed around his eyes. He shouted at her to stop pretending to understand those beneath them. Donetta furrowed his brows, recalling the past as if it had just occurred. He remembered furious villagers attacking, labeling them as Republican demons. Romantica sighed heavily, acknowledging that there were indeed reasons for the animosity between the classes. She rose and bowed before Donetta, informing him that her group would soon transfer to the Alpha class. Her gaze shifted uncertainly around the room when Donetta declared that they were now enemies. His fury did not wane. He proclaimed that he would not allow the transfer. Romantica stood firmly, hands on her hips, and challenged him not to underestimate them. Leaving behind a half-eaten steak and the wooden training sword, she stepped away from the table. Donetta remained seated, arms folded, head bowed. He gripped his elbow so tightly that veins bulged across his arm. His thoughts drifted to a city consumed by flames during an execution. He remembered the cries of townspeople demanding justice. A hooded executioner stood beside a bound noble, preparing to deliver punishment. One man in the crowd screamed about losing his son, demanding the aristocrat's head. Tears welled in Donetta's eyes as he relived the moment. The crowd had been relentless, shouting for the death of the head of the noble household. Above the stage, a swamp-colored flag bearing an emblem fluttered beneath the night sky. Donetta clenched his fist so tightly it bled. His rage remained, his memory vivid, and his hatred for the past unhealed. A wooden house, adorned with numerous windows, stood bright under the sunlight. Inside, a blond man inquired about the progress of a special interview related to Hebrion Academy. An assistant, who had been working on the task, responded that he was nearly finished. In response, the blond man abruptly stood and hurled sheets of paper toward him, demanding he take the interview materials. The assistant placed a stack of books on the blonde's desk, each detailing the history of Hebrion Academy, then pointed to the completed forms. With a swift movement, he turned away from his superior. The man asked whether anything similar had occurred before, but his assistant denied it. Pressed for time, the manager insisted they move quickly to publish the news before rival papers. A sly smile crossed his face, knowing the coverage would create a sensation. Meanwhile, sunlight filtered over the vast academy building nestled in greenery. Students gathered in the assembly hall. Pram, the blue-haired boy, appeared confused by the sudden summons. Many students stared at the stage where a green board displayed several photographs. No one could understand how such a thing had happened. A solitary golden door stood in a quiet corridor. In another office, Romantica stood by a window veiled in red curtains. She smiled gently and sipped coffee, proud that Desir had completed his task successfully. A document lay on the nearby wooden desk. Elsewhere, loud crashing echoed from the Alpha class building. A dish shattered, spilling a mysterious liquid near 3 students. Ajest, standing before the others in her academy uniform, turned back, golden eyes narrowed. She cursed softly. In a separate room, Professor Fergman slammed his fists on a desk, his voice sharp as he scolded someone for their arrogance. Rising from his chair, he failed to understand how the beta class dared to challenge their hierarchy. Leaning over the blank papers scattered before him, he declared angrily that commoners would soon be transferred into Alpha class. Fergman's voice grew louder as he labeled the situation nonsense. He hurled a crumpled piece of paper, which Ajest caught deftly. She glanced at her palm, now holding the bald document. Fergman struck the desk again, stating that Professor Bridget was behind the humiliating decision. His frustration mounted. Sweat trickled down his face as the realization dawned: he would have to confront Desir personally. It was Bridget who had recommended Desir's admission into the academy. The students continued to watch in silence as Fergman pounded the table one more time. He questioned how Desir dared to defy them. His fury distorted his face, veins rising visibly along his temple. A document lay beneath his hand, bearing a photograph of Desir and Romantica, the beta class group that had reached the top 30. Desir's bruised face stared out from the page. Fergman hammered the table again, his insults against Desir growing more vile. He resolved to eliminate Desir from the academy. Sunlight filtered once more over the Alpha class building. Fergman exhaled deeply as he returned to his seat. He apologized to the students for his inappropriate outburst, though he reaffirmed that commoners had no place among them. His eyes turned toward the Blue Moon group, tasking them with dismantling Desir's team by any means. In exchange, he promised them the title of first rank. A sudden thought struck Fergman. He had not yet selected a leader for the first group. Ajest stood between Donetta and Percival, her hands clasped behind her back. Sitting on a red chair, Fergman addressed her by name and asked whether she had fought Desir. Ajest, frowning slightly, nodded in affirmation. He then asked if she could defeat him this time. Dressed in a crisp white shirt, Ajest stated that she had already considered several strategies. A smile formed on Fergman's face. That was enough. He announced Ajest as the leader of the first group. Standing upright, Ajest remained silent as Donetta turned back to glance at her. When Fergman asked for objections, none were raised. The red-haired boy furrowed his brows but remained quiet as Ajest confirmed her acceptance. Fergman gave his final command. He wanted Desir's group eliminated. Ajest lowered her gaze, recalling the last time she had fought him. Her hand tightened into a fist as she remembered how Desir had bested her. She recalled the awkward tension between them during their prior meeting. Determined not to repeat past mistakes, she closed her eyes and focused. This time, she would not lose. Her expression hardened with resolve. The pastel-colored corridors of the academy stood empty. Ajest, her shoulder decorated with an epaulette, walked slowly. She lowered her head as Donetta and Percival approached. Donetta apologized for disturbing her. When Ajest looked up, she recognized them. Donetta stood uncertainly before her, with Percival just behind. Donetta then made a request, followed by Percival, who had his own matter to raise. Pressed against a post, Percival remained quiet as Ajest asked whether they opposed her leadership. Donetta, brows furrowed, denied such a thing. He looked up and asked her to leave Romantica to him. Percival, in turn, wished to confront Pram personally. Ajest stared at them blankly as they began to explain themselves. Donetta admitted that Ajest was strong enough to defeat all three of them, so he hoped to face Romantica alone, citing personal reasons. However, Percival's constant interruptions annoyed Donetta and he snapped at him to cut it out. The red-haired Percival looked back at Donetta, confused. He asked what he had done wrong. Ajest, her head slightly lowered, said she had little interest in either of them. Then she reminded them of her position as the group leader. Lifting her golden eyes, she instructed them not to touch Desir. Desir entered the library and approached a table, dropping a heavy stack of books with a loud thud that drew the attention of Romantica and Pram. Romantica frowned, glancing at the titles with curiosity. Desir placed his hands on the pile, identifying them as chronicles of historical events, architectural analyses of the previous clock tower, and research documents dated back to the year 1218. One of the books had a tower illustrated on its cover. Romantica skeptically reached for a book and asked why he had brought them. Pram looked on, puzzled. As Desir flipped through the pages with a calm smile, Romantica brightened slightly, intrigued by the content. Desir then closed the book and announced that their regular training would be paused for the time being. Instead, they would focus on history. Romantica stared at him in disbelief before her confusion gave way to a sharp outburst that echoed throughout the library. She repeated his words, stunned. Desir gestured for silence and returned the book to the table. He explained the necessity of understanding the historical background of the 5th-level Shadow World, which would be the setting for their upcoming qualification exam. Producing a magic stone, he activated it, releasing sheets of paper that fluttered down as a projection formed. A book materialized beside the papers. Desir elaborated that purifying shadow worlds granted soul stones, each containing complete records of their corresponding worlds. The one they would soon face had been reconstructed based on such data. He rested his hand on his belt, stating that this made the recreated world partially controllable. With accurate information, they could plan strategically. Romantica flipped through another book, clearly dissatisfied. Pram asked if he meant that during previous entrance exams, sensations like pain were artificially dulled. Desir pointed to an image of a clock hand and noted that while some variables could be managed, the core events and missions within a shadow world remained fixed. This made historical knowledge critical. The pile of books loomed between them. Romantica asked if he was sure these texts would help in the exam. Desir admitted there was no certainty, though the likelihood was high. Romantica groaned and pressed her forehead into her palm, complaining that the material might turn out to be useless after all. Desir silently watched them. He disliked forcing others, though he understood the need for preparation. Pram glanced at him quietly. Romantica, clearly annoyed, made a subtle downward gesture with her hand. Desir explained that after reading the materials, they would each prepare a report summarizing the important findings. He lowered his head, closing his eyes. Despite having knowledge of the future, he could not tell them exactly which shadow world they would face. They began reading in silence. Romantica, lost in thought, held a book in her hands while Pram sat next to Desir, awkwardly flipping pages. Romantica raised an eyebrow, then smirked and waved her hand in front of Pram's face. She leaned forward with a teasing look and asked whether he was getting too close to Desir. Pram blushed and muttered that he simply felt more comfortable with Desir lately. Turning away, he questioned whether Romantica genuinely thought so. A dark tie with a yellow tag hung around his neck. Romantica looked at it and asked about his outfit, suggesting with a mischievous tone that maybe they had gone on a date without telling her. Pram, flustered, buried his face in his book and began reciting historical dates and facts loudly, clearly trying to change the subject. Romantica started kicking him lightly under the table, insisting that he stop dodging her question. Pram pleaded for her to quit. Desir raised his head with a strained smile, silently wondering what they were doing. Romantica pressed Pram to tell the truth, though he responded with confusion. While they argued, a book slipped off the table and hit the floor. Both of them yelped in surprise. Desir turned toward them, his expression unimpressed. He closed his book and reminded them to stay focused. Both quickly nodded. Romantica bent down to retrieve the book. She refused Pram's offer to help and reached for it herself. Just before her hand touched it, another hand picked it up first. She looked up to thank the person but froze when she recognized who it was. Her expression shifted into a frown as she watched Ajest hand the book over calmly after brushing off some dust. Romantica snatched the book from her and slammed it onto the table before sitting down again with her arms crossed, clearly displeased. Ajest passed by without a word. Pram turned to look between Romantica and Ajest, confused by the tension. Ajest pulled a chair across from Desir and sat down, remarking that it had been a while. Desir responded with a casual smile, estimating that it had been around 2 months. Pram listened, surprised by the familiarity between them. Desir mentioned hearing that she had joined the Blue Moon group, calling it a wise decision that suited her well. Ajest asked why he thought that. Before Romantica could interject, Desir answered that he believed Blue Moon's strength aligned with Ajest's abilities. However, Ajest closed her eyes and replied that the group had declined in strength. She fixed her gaze on Desir and stated that the reason for that decline was him. Desir smiled awkwardly and tilted his head slightly. Ajest called his name and began to speak again. Before she could finish, Desir guessed her intention. He asked if she had come to declare war. He looked directly at her, confident that she saw him as a rival and wanted to settle matters before the qualification exam began. Ajest lowered her head and exhaled. She admitted that he understood her well. Raising her head again, she confirmed that she did see him as a worthy opponent. Desir closed his eyes and smiled, saying it was an honor. Ajest stood from her chair. She admitted that during their last encounter, she had underestimated him due to her own carelessness. She apologized for that and assured him that this time would be different. Her expression grew serious as she declared her intent to defeat him. Desir leaned slightly to the side, smiling again. He was glad to hear it. Her competitive fire was something he had hoped to reignite. He remembered their battle and knew that his effort then had not just been for victory. She was crucial to overcoming the Shadow Labyrinth, and she needed to grow stronger than she was. With her usual composed demeanor, Ajest turned and walked away. Desir watched her leave and quietly looked forward to their next battle. A bird glided above the arena as the day of the qualification exam dawned. Spectators filled the surrounding stands, their voices blending into a restless hum. Reporters with notepads hurried to transcribe the statements of a blonde official who addressed the crowd. The arena's exit remained cloaked in darkness, casting a long shadow across the platform where candidates would soon appear. Desir, Romantica, and Pram emerged from the corridor, stepping into the boisterous stadium. Romantica commented on the overwhelming noise, prompting Desir to adjust his gloves as he explained that this was the Academy's most anticipated event. He spoke with composure, his gaze calmly sweeping across the crowd. He and Romantica exchanged a confident glance, while Pram quietly adjusted the sword secured at his waist. Romantica turned fully toward Desir and observed him closely. Desir returned her gaze, and Pram, noticing their interaction, appeared surprised when Romantica pointed out that Desir had properly tied his tie for once. His tie had been neatly fastened, more formal than usual. Desir explained that today's occasion demanded a polished appearance, though he typically preferred a more casual style. Romantica clasped her hands behind her head, beaming brightly. Pram raised his hands with a faint, embarrassed gesture. Romantica teased that Desir likely avoided ties just to flaunt his physique. Desir looked startled by the remark, asking what she meant. Pram shyly added that Desir looked good either way, then awkwardly suggested they could look into more comfortable tie options. Romantica repeated that the noise outside was greater than she had expected. Desir offered a faint smile, reassured by their nerves. For him, anxiety at this moment was a good sign. He turned to his teammates and asked if they were ready. Both nodded firmly in response. His foot pressed into the ground, signaling his determination. Cheers erupted from the crowd as onlookers recognized them. Excitement surged through the stands. The blonde official, standing near the entrance, cast a side glance at the trio and muttered something bitter about their presence. Desir, Romantica, and Pram advanced steadily toward the arena floor, drawing louder support from their fans. Desir appeared surprised by the warm welcome. Romantica expressed her disbelief, echoing the unexpected nature of the crowd's reaction. Across the arena, a long-haired member of Ajest's team eyed Desir critically, remarking to himself how ordinary he appeared. A blue-haired girl beside him warned against underestimating Desir and reminded him of the professor's warning. Desir remained focused and lighthearted as he addressed his teammates. He reassured them that he had not forgotten anything and declared that their team would outperform the rest. Ajest, standing quietly ahead, glanced at her squad and maintained her composure despite the building tension. Desir shifted into a more strategic mindset. He faced his teammates and assigned their roles. Romantica was designated the sniper. She would locate enemies using detection magic and eliminate them swiftly. She visualized herself with a bow and questioned whether her spells would be effective against alpha-class opponents. A moment of hesitation showed in her expression. Desir explained that the key was to strike immediately after detection. Even elite students could not react quickly if caught off guard. Romantica admitted that she had never attacked from long range and was unsure how much effort would be needed. Desir offered a calming smile. He reminded her of the training orb she had used repeatedly. It had been as hard as a human skull. She remembered the gray sphere and realized the purpose behind his training had been this very moment. Her hesitation faded, and she nodded with new understanding. He turned to Pram next, who straightened with determination. Desir told him that his role was to protect the team. Romantica, watching Desir explain everything so clearly, began to wonder about who he truly was. She acknowledged that their roles were now clear, then asked about Desir's own objective. Desir lowered his head slightly and crossed his arms. With a dramatic tone, he revealed that he would act as the playmaker, managing the operation from within the battlefield itself. A loud announcement rang out. The shadow gates had opened, signaling the start of the test. Students were ordered to proceed. Clad in red uniforms, Desir's team moved forward with steady confidence. Ajest's squad stepped ahead as well. Desir looked straight ahead, a calm smile forming. Pram silently clenched his fists in preparation. The arena's voice declared the official start of the qualification exam. Inside the simulation zone, beams of sunlight filtered through thick trees. In the middle of a clearing, a glowing circle shimmered to life. Desir stood within it, carefully observing his surroundings. He noted it was around noon. Lifting his head, he listened to the arena's narration. Participants were now soldiers. Their mission involved finding and confirming the location of an enemy base using intercepted intelligence. Desir moved through the forest alone, noting the absence of his teammates. He closed his eyes briefly, staying composed. An arrow suddenly shot past him, striking a tree behind. He examined the glowing mark left on the bark. An ambush had begun. A blue-haired alpha-class girl stepped out from behind a tree, one hand pressed against its trunk. She admitted that encountering him so soon was unexpected. Desir grinned and questioned whether he had become popular. She replied that his fame stemmed from failure. She fired a blue energy blast. Desir raised his hand and countered with a stream of fire. The spell tore through the underbrush. She responded by forming dual magic circles, preparing to cast 2 spells at once. A massive wave of water surged in front of her, followed by a blue projectile racing toward Desir. He retaliated with another flame spell, observing carefully. One of her spells had defensive properties. The water wave hardened into jagged ice. Shards erupted from the surface, glistening with lethal intent. Desir remained focused as the ice began to crack and split. He speculated that her opposing elements might have weakened each other. Suddenly, a radiant blue light burst from within the fractured surface. The explosion followed, illuminating the clearing in a flash of magical energy. Desir stood in silence, momentarily stunned by the force and precision of the attack. Desir was flung backward, shielding his face with both arms as fragments of ice burst around him. His boots dug into the ground, carving furrows through the earth as he slid to a halt. Shards continued to rain down from above, forcing him to brace himself. His arms remained crossed in front of his face while the broken pieces pelted the area around him. He lifted his gaze and observed the suspended fragments, surprised to find them frozen in midair. Without warning, the shards accelerated, slicing through the air at high speed. A whirlwind formed overhead, roaring with immense force as it spiraled upward into a towering tornado. The icy winds tore through the trees, scattering debris and splintering branches. Glancing at his hand, Desir noted a bleeding scratch where one fragment had nicked him. Another slashed across his cheek, drawing blood that trailed down his face. The tornado loomed above the treetops, wide and unrelenting. Calmly, Desir wiped the blood from his face. Across from him stood an alpha-class student, a girl with long hair and a haughty expression. She stared at him with visible contempt, asking if he was impressed by her magic. With disdain in her voice, she declared that someone like him would never attain such a level of power. Her gaze sharpened as she demanded to know his final words. Desir placed his hand on his belt, tilting his head slightly. His expression remained composed. He acknowledged the spell's quality, remarking that it had indeed been impressive. A faint smile touched his lips, but his tone held no reverence. The girl's face twisted in irritation. In response, Desir raised one hand. Two interlocking magic circles materialized in front of him, radiating light. His gaze bore into hers as he stated that she had made a mistake by choosing him as her opponent. Suddenly, the magic circle around her hand disintegrated. Her confident expression faltered as she looked upward. The tornado above her unraveled and vanished. A cold realization settled in her eyes. Her lips trembled as she grasped the truth. Her magic had been analyzed and dismantled. Ice fragments fell harmlessly to the ground. Desir calmly advised her not to underestimate her opponent and to always anticipate the next move. He described it as the basic principle of combat. With a subtle smile, he extended his hand again. A blue magic circle emerged, pulsing with energy. The scattered ice shards lifted and floated in front of him, forming a unified cluster. The girl's irritation intensified. She shouted, demanding to know how her spell could be manipulated by someone like him. Desir replied with quiet confidence, instructing her to simply observe. An ice projectile launched toward her with precision and speed. Alarmed, she stepped back and summoned a defensive circle. Her brow furrowed, and she vowed that the magic of a commoner would not bring her down. Before she could reposition, massive chunks of ice surged from all directions. Her eyes widened in shock. The impact was immediate. Her body was struck multiple times, blood erupting from her mouth as she cried out Desir's name. Her limbs gave way and she collapsed onto the cold ground, defeated. A golden plaque slipped from her grasp and landed near her crumpled form. The mechanical voice of the arena echoed across the battlefield, announcing the elimination of one participant. Desir glanced briefly at the fallen plaque. The voice continued, confirming that 29 competitors remained. He resumed walking. The forest canopy allowed narrow rays of sunlight to pierce through, casting mottled light on the forest floor as he moved onward. Elsewhere, a blonde-haired boy trudged through tall, dense grass. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he commented on the unexpected heat and questioned how he had wandered into the meadow. A breeze rolled across the clearing, causing the grass to sway gently. Grateful for the wind, he turned to face it. In the next instant, a surge of force swept through the air. The arena's voice returned, announcing the elimination of another participant. Only 27 remained. At a nearby location, Romantica stood with her arm outstretched. Her fingers glowed faintly, charged with aura. She lowered her hand into a fist and focused her gaze toward the horizon. Beside her stood Pram, the blue-haired swordsman. He asked if she had found Desir. Romantica responded that she had not. She explained that he must have been transported to a distant part of the battlefield. Placing her hands on her belt, she smiled and remarked that at least she and Pram had landed near each other. Pram looked at her curiously, asking if she would be able to locate Desir soon. Romantica offered a brief nod, then asked him to step aside. She closed her eyes and began concentrating. Swirling currents of air and aura enveloped her body as she activated her detection spell. Pram remained silent, scanning their surroundings. In her mind's eye, Romantica perceived 3 glowing lights nearby and another further away, 4 targets in total. She raised her hand and extended 2 fingers to the side, gathering mana. Romantica fired a concentrated shot in the direction of the distant target. She muttered that she would eliminate that one first. However, a faint unease stirred within her. The reaction of her spell made her suspect that it had been analyzed. Her brows knit tightly together. Pram glanced at her, noticing the shift in her expression. She then smiled slightly and declared that she had located Desir. Suddenly, a girl's voice called out, shouting Desir's name in surprise. From the side, a figure emerged. It was not Desir. A boy in a purple uniform stepped into view, his hand resting casually on his belt. Behind him stood a red-haired girl, observing the situation silently. The boy commented that carelessly using detection spells could reveal one's location. His tone turned mocking as he remarked that such incompetence was expected from people like them. Romantica and Pram stared at him without flinching. Romantica repeated his insult, her tone laced with defiance. She added that it would soon be clear who the real trash was. The sky stretched blue above the forest canopy, sunlight slipping through the rustling leaves. 2 figures emerged cautiously from the underbrush, Romantica and Pram, both members of the beta class. Romantica extended her arms outward, adopting a confident stance. Pram stood beside her, sword drawn and held firmly in both hands. Despite being spotted by Alpha class members, Romantica remained unfazed. She mocked their confidence, questioning what made them so certain of victory. A sarcastic smile tugged at her lips while Pram shifted slightly, eyes fixed on their opponents. One of the Alpha class students turned toward his partner, then back to Romantica. A cruel grin spread across his face as he declared the outcome obvious. A burst of motion followed as dust clouded the forest floor. Pram had launched the first attack. His opponent used a massive weapon to shield himself just in time, gritting his teeth and glaring with disdain. He sneered at their manners, or lack thereof, before swinging his blade. Pram leapt backward, his movements precise, yet the Alpha student growled in irritation and demanded he back off. Romantica clenched her fist. Pram returned to her side, eyes slightly widened. He reported that he had managed to repel the enemy's attack, though it was no easy feat. Romantica, calm but firm, warned him not to underestimate the Alpha class. Their opponents were clearly not ordinary. Across from them, the female Alpha student looked toward her comrade in concern, mouth agape. She asked if he was all right, to which he scoffed and assured her that such an ambush could not possibly injure him. Anger tightened his jaw as he barked at her to stop panicking and focus. A fight was still unfolding. Romantica stood tall with a faint smirk, while Pram readied himself again. Steel clashed as their blades met. Pram retreated slightly, evaluating his opponent's next move. The Alpha student raised his arm, energy surging behind him. With a sudden flare of blue magic, projectiles formed and shot at Pram. Yet the boy dodged with practiced agility, weaving through the attack and closing the distance. His brows furrowed as he pushed his speed to its limit. Using the trees as springboards, Pram circled them with remarkable grace. His movements stunned the Alpha participant, who had not expected such skill from a beta-class student. Her astonishment was written clearly on her face. Her partner, in contrast, roared and swung his weapon in a wide arc, slamming it into the ground. Dust flew skyward in heavy plumes. He yelled at them not to underestimate him, fury lacing his voice. Raising one hand toward his comrade, he ordered her to activate detection magic immediately. The female Alpha student responded, casting a column of blue energy through the settling dust. Unexpectedly, the beam struck her own teammate. Pain twisted her face as she bent over, screaming. Her comrade stared, bewildered. Romantica stood behind the scene, fingers extended and glowing with magical energy. Her voice cut through the haze, reminding them that Pram was not the only threat they should have accounted for. Her grin widened, and her tone turned mischievous. With her hand raised, she mocked them for forgetting her entirely, suggesting that such disregard would not go unpunished. The injured participant writhed on the ground while her comrade yelled for her to get up. Before he could react further, Pram materialized near him, blade gleaming. Pram chastised him for turning his back on an opponent mid-battle. The Alpha student gritted his teeth and raised his weapon with both hands, swinging hard. His shout echoed through the forest as he insisted that no one had the right to lecture him. The heavy blade carved the air, but Pram soared above it, evading the strike effortlessly. The Alpha student's eyes widened in disbelief. Pram was already mid-air, descending with precision. The speed of the counterattack was overwhelming. The student could no longer keep up. Pram closed the distance in a blink, warning him that it was already too late. Desperation showed in the student's eyes as he realized he could not respond in time. Romantica, having completed her preparation, raised her hand once more, wind stirring around her. Magical energy crackled between her fingers. She smirked as she unleashed the attack. A surge of blue energy shot forward, hitting the Alpha student directly. His eyes narrowed, disbelieving. The explosion sent smoke billowing. Moments later, a glowing notification confirmed his elimination. Romantica stepped forward, approaching the dissolving silhouette now reduced to a field of flickering blue pixels. She remarked that their mistake had been prioritizing Pram alone. Had they gone after her immediately, the outcome might have been different. She stared at the fading form, commenting that underestimating the beta class had been a costly error. Turning away, she glanced at Pram. He stood near the disappearing female participant. When she called to him, asking if he was finished, he nodded and sheathed his sword. Another notification confirmed the second elimination. Pram jogged over to Romantica, a small smile forming as he noted how easy the battle had been. Romantica agreed, remarking that it would be a gift if all their enemies dropped their guards so easily. She winked playfully, while Pram blushed faintly at the praise. She complimented his growth, to which Pram humbly attributed his improvement to Desir. He looked around, curious. Romantica, with a sudden shift in expression, opened her mouth wide in irritation. She turned toward the trees and shouted for Desir to stop hiding. She claimed he had been watching the entire time. Desir rose from the bushes, startling Pram. He admitted that Romantica had caught him completely. Romantica stared at him, muttering to herself that he was rather strange. Desir smiled sheepishly, scratching the back of his head. He admitted that their performance had been so captivating that he had simply enjoyed observing. He stepped into view as Pram rushed over to him. Desir told them that he had been planning to help but realized they had everything under control. Romantica, crossing her arms, scoffed that they obviously didn't need assistance. Pram asked what Desir had seen during his time hidden. Both turned toward Desir, curious. Romantica asked what he thought of their performance. Desir placed his hands on his hips, smiling. He told them they had fought far better than he had anticipated. Pram lit up at the praise and asked if Desir really meant it. Desir nodded and patted Pram on the head. The younger boy blushed again, smiling with pride. Romantica, watching the exchange, frowned slightly. It bothered her that Desir had effortlessly analyzed her spell. Despite being on the same team, his skill made her uneasy. She crossed her arms, raising one brow as she studied him. Desir then turned to her, addressing her by name. He reached out and patted her head as well. Romantica froze in surprise. Her face flushed, and her mouth opened slightly, clearly unsure how to react. When Desir removed his hand, she swung her fists in frustration, not fully understanding his intentions. Desir teased that she looked like she had wanted his praise too. Romantica fired back that she had never looked like that. He chuckled and turned his gaze skyward. Pram ran to Romantica's side, both of them still somewhat baffled. Desir observed that the day was ending, and the event would soon begin. The sky dimmed, gray clouds gathered quickly overhead. In the distance, lightning arced above the clock tower. Red eyes glinted ominously from within the bushes. The next trial was about to start. Thick gray clouds loomed above the forest as an eerie stillness settled over the trees. Without warning, a column of flames erupted into the sky, breaking the silence. One of the students was caught in the blast, his body engulfed by the magical fire as he collapsed to the ground, screaming in agony. A red-cloaked student stood nearby, watching the burning figure with cold detachment. He turned away as the blue trail of his fleeing opponent faded from view, remarking to himself that the victim had merely been unfortunate. Notifications soon appeared in the air against the darkening sky, stating that one participant had been eliminated, leaving only 24 remaining. Desir and his team turned at once toward the source of the notification. Romantica, seated on the damp earth and visibly shaken, stared up at the floating message. She asked Desir about the plan he had hinted at earlier. Desir, standing in the middle of their camp, explained calmly that they had only 2 realistic ways to ascend to Alpha class. A stick rested nearby on the wet soil, marked with holes from earlier use. Desir sat on a fallen log, surrounded by Pram and Romantica, who each sat on stones. He told them that the first method involved completing the Shadow World's mission before any other team. Romantica, recalling his earlier warning, reminded him that he had already said such a feat was impossible. Desir agreed, spreading his arms slightly. Given their current strength, they could not simultaneously fulfill the mission and repel attacks from other teams. Both Pram and Romantica looked at him with wide eyes, acknowledging the truth of his words. He then picked up the stick and began sketching in the dirt. Desir pointed out that the second method, survival, offered a more feasible path. If they managed to be among the last 9 remaining participants, they would qualify for promotion regardless of ranking. While explaining this, he drew circles and lines on the ground, illustrating his logic. Other teams would soon begin to fight among themselves, and with only 24 students left, 15 still needed to be eliminated. He raised the stick, smiling confidently, reinforcing that survival was their best chance. Pram and Romantica listened closely, arms crossed, as Desir mapped out his strategy. Pram remarked that a simpler plan sounded far more practical. Desir responded by drawing caricatures of the 3 of them in the dirt, which made Romantica laugh softly as she touched her cheek. Suddenly, lightning flashed across the sky, and heavy rain began to fall. The trio quickly sought shelter beneath a tall tree. Water poured around them in sheets as they scanned their surroundings. Desir gazed upward while Romantica and Pram remained alert. Pram acknowledged that the downpour would not stop soon. Romantica noted that executing the plan under such weather would prove difficult and asked what they should do instead. Pram huddled closer to Desir, who gently patted his head with a warm smile. Pram murmured that he still felt fine despite the circumstances. Desir suggested that they rest for now. As he continued to stroke Pram's head, Romantica glanced about nervously. Desir's ambition of getting them into the top 9 weighed heavily on her mind. If left on her own, she would never have imagined being able to compete with alpha-class students. Her thoughts wandered. Perhaps if she had accepted Danetta's offer and concealed her origins, her path might have been different. In her imagination, Danetta's sneering expression reminded her that commoners were not welcomed. By now, most would have discovered her background. In that moment, Desir placed a white-gloved hand gently on her head, trying to soothe her. A bright smile appeared on his face as Pram and Romantica leaned against him from both sides. Desir praised her efforts and assured her she was doing well. Romantica wondered aloud what would happen if danger came suddenly. Desir reassured her that he would remain by her side. His sincerity touched her. She smiled softly, warmth replacing her anxiety. Meanwhile, Pram still clung to Desir's arm. Desir tried to withdraw, but Romantica swatted his hand away irritably, insisting no one should touch her. Pram remarked playfully that she had returned to her usual self, though Romantica admitted inwardly that she had grown fond of both her teammates. Elsewhere in the forest, rain fell hard over the stone structure known as the Tower Chapel. The golden bell continued ringing, its loud echo piercing the storm. Desir and his team turned their attention to the sky. Other groups, including those in red and blue cloaks, did the same. All of them reacted with concern. Desir stared at the latest notification. Romantica asked what it meant, sensing the shift in his expression. Desir's knowledge allowed him to interpret what was happening. A magical device inside the Black Tower Chapel had been activated. It would summon a demon every hour. Romantica blinked in disbelief at the message, which confirmed the appearance of a new task. The forest was now filled with demons. The red-cloaked team moved through the rain, visibly agitated. A long-haired boy urged caution, while a girl behind him responded with sarcasm. The blue-cloaked team also grew tense as they studied the objective. Their task was to survive the demon attacks. Completion would only come with the destruction of the demon. Thunder rolled through the skies as bolts of red lightning illuminated the clouds. Romantica glanced nervously at the sound nearby. Desir quickly reached for her hand, guiding her behind him. He moved forward into the rain while Pram and Romantica remained beneath the tree, calling after him anxiously. Desir lowered his head to observe the forest floor, now soaked and murky. Raindrops hammered down as Pram and Romantica held their noses, disturbed by a sudden stench. Desir's brow furrowed as he stared ahead, sensing something. The ground began to tremble. A bulge rose from the soil. With his face slick with rain, Desir stared intently, understanding that a demon was emerging. He spun toward his companions, motioning urgently for them to prepare themselves. The shaking intensified. Then, a monstrous rat burst from underground. Pram and Romantica froze, their mouths agape in terror. Panic set in as they tried to hide behind Desir. The rat clawed its way free and stood tall, baring sharp teeth in a vicious snarl. Romantica and Pram clung to each other in panic, crying out to Desir for help. The beast growled fiercely, the storm rumbling above as Desir faced it. Without wasting time, Desir ordered his teammates to retreat. Pram and Romantica obeyed instantly, running back with fear etched on their faces. The rat spun its head and glared at them. Desir remained still for a moment, realizing the worst was yet to come. A surge of movement followed as more creatures emerged. A swarm of demonic rats with glowing red eyes clawed their way from the earth. The ground tore apart beneath them, and the group was soon surrounded. With danger drawing near, Desir steeled himself, ready to protect his team as the horde advanced. Desir turned back just as Romantica and Pram sprinted ahead without hesitation. Behind them, a Kildra rat glared menacingly, its bloodthirsty eyes locked onto its prey. Without a second's delay, Desir and the others broke into a full run, chased by a swarm of ferocious rats that surged through the forest like a wave. Rain poured steadily from above, soaking the dirt trail and masking the thunderous patter of countless claws. A notification hovered in Desir's vision. It urged him to use his knowledge to identify the creature. He quickly scanned the rat's characteristics: black armor, razor-sharp fangs, and violent aggression. There was no doubt, it was a Kildra rat, a rank 2 demon known for its control over swarms and its obsession with the scent of human blood. Once it marked a target, escape became nearly impossible. Romantica, who had taken the lead, turned around and fired a gust of wind at the swarm. The blue energy swept across the path, but the rats pushed forward unbothered. Panic showed in Romantica's eyes as she ran, the boys closed behind her. Desir called out, warning her to conserve her mana. She would need it later. Romantica shouted back, voice trembling, urging Desir to act quickly. Her desperation was palpable. A rat launched itself forward, narrowly missing Desir's shoulder. He glanced back and saw one clinging to his soaked shirt. He tore it off as they continued to run, his mind racing for a solution. Yet no clear answer came. Ahead of him, Pram and Romantica suddenly shouted. Desir snapped his head forward and saw what had alarmed them. A massive tree trunk had fallen across the path, forming an impassable barricade. Rain made the wood slick and dangerous. Romantica's eyes widened when she noticed Pram wasn't slowing down. Instead, he adjusted his grip on his sword and launched himself into the air at Desir's order. Despite the treacherous surface, Pram's leap was clean. He landed on the other side and quickly turned around, shouting that he had made it across. Desir looked toward Romantica with urgency. She was frozen in place, fear rooting her to the ground. He urged her to jump. She crouched, visibly trembling, and hesitated. The rats were closing in. Desir watched as she finally pushed off the ground, but she landed awkwardly and collapsed onto the muddy forest floor. He rushed over, reaching out to help her up. Pram, now a few paces away, looked on with concern. Behind them, the rats tore through the fallen tree with terrifying force. The chase resumed, their claws splintering bark as they pressed forward. Desir, Romantica, and Pram ran again, this time with desperation carving deep lines across their faces. The rats gained ground quickly. It became clear that running wouldn't be enough. Desir yelled that there was still one way to escape. They needed to eliminate the leader. Without its command, the swarm would fall into disarray. Romantica, eyes wild with fear and frustration, demanded to know where this leader was. Desir's eyes narrowed. The boss was hiding within the pack itself. The suggestion raised more questions than answers. How would they reach the leader buried among hundreds of ravenous demons? Before anyone could reply, Desir came to an abrupt halt. Romantica and Pram paused beside him, confused. Desir tightened his gloves, then removed one, revealing his bare hand. Without hesitation, he bit into his palm, drawing blood. He knew what the Kildra rats craved. Holding his bleeding hand forward, he let the blood splatter onto the forest floor, hoping it would lure the leader. The response was instant. The swarm became frenzied, their red eyes gleaming brighter. A sudden beam of red light burst upward from the center of the horde. The boss had taken the bait. The massive rat leapt high above its kin, soaring toward the scent of blood. Desir signaled Romantica. This was her moment. The boss was exposed. Romantica extended her hand, channeling her mana. A powerful gust formed, shaped into a compressed projectile of wind. She unleashed her air bullet skill with precision. The blue energy slammed directly into the leader's chest. Smoke burst from the impact. Desir watched closely, but something felt off. Despite the successful hit, the demon's eyes glowed again, this time with an even deeper red. It had taken damage, yet remained far from defeated. The pack halted, watching their airborne leader with reverence. Romantica panicked, doubting the strength of her spell. Desir encouraged her, explaining that even weakened, a rank 2 demon was never easy to defeat. The boss crashed back into the swarm. The situation worsened. Desir's alarm intensified as the rats regrouped around their leader. Suddenly, a streak of blue light passed beside Desir. Pram had moved. Desir yelled at him to stop, but it was too late. Romantica joined in, shouting frantically. Pram, ignoring them both, dove into the sea of rats with his sword drawn. His body disappeared beneath the pack as he began slashing through them, searching for the boss. Romantica stared, stunned by his recklessness. Desir didn't hesitate. He followed after Pram, plunging into the swarm despite the overwhelming odds. Romantica called out, asking if she should use her magic again. Desir shouted back that she had to hold it. Any misfire could hit Pram. Romantica bit her lip as she watched Desir vanish into the fray. Inside the chaotic storm of teeth and fur, Pram closed his eyes briefly, shielding himself with his arms. He focused his senses, searching for the rat he had injured earlier. He knew the boss would be marked by the wound Romantica had inflicted. Rats clashed and snarled around him, but Pram pressed forward. He knew what to look for. His eyes locked onto a glint of black fur, marred by a faint scorch. That was the one. At that moment, Desir arrived at the edge of the pack, pushing and clawing his way through. Romantica stood back, anxious and powerless. She watched the rats tighten around Desir and Pram, their glowing eyes like lanterns in the storm. Suddenly, a beam of bright blue light erupted from the swarm. Pram shot upward, sword piercing the air. His blade struck the boss mid-flight, slicing through its armored hide. The rat screeched as blue fragments burst from its body, dissolving into light. Pram landed smoothly, though Romantica jumped slightly at his sudden reappearance. The demon's remains evaporated, leaving behind only silence and a notification. The CRA rat had been eliminated. Desir sprinted to his teammates. Romantica stared at Pram in awe. Desir asked if he was all right. Pram, clearly dazed, closed one eye and stumbled backward. His knees buckled. Desir and Romantica rushed to catch him. As they did, the final message appeared before them. The survival mission had been completed. Desir rushed to Pram's side as the young swordsman staggered, clearly struggling to stay upright. Without waiting for him to fall, Desir caught him in his arms just before his legs gave out completely. Pram's face showed signs of exhaustion, yet behind the fatigue was a glint of pride. Romantica moved closer and observed Pram silently, her eyes wide with concern but softened by a trace of admiration. Desir glanced at Pram's battered form and acknowledged his efforts, his voice steady. Pram smiled in return, clearly satisfied with what he had accomplished. He admitted he had overexerted himself and was extremely tired. Desir responded with a light laugh, his features relaxing as he reassured him. Pram's eyes fluttered closed while resting in Desir's arms. He murmured his thanks before allowing himself to fall into much-needed sleep. Romantica observed the moment with quiet astonishment, then asked if Pram had fallen asleep. Desir confirmed it with a slight nod, his white-gloved hand still holding Pram securely. He instructed Romantica to look after him, then gently passed the sleeping boy into her care. Outside, raindrops began to fall, rolling down the tall blades of grass that blanketed the area. Romantica laid Pram against the base of a nearby tree, shielding him as best she could. Desir took a step forward, his boots squelching against the soggy earth, ready to continue the mission. Romantica turned towards him with concern, her gaze following his retreating figure. He halted and tilted his face skyward, the cold rain falling directly onto him. In that brief, quiet moment, Desir reflected on the situation. He had been too confident. What had seemed like an easily manageable task had nearly cost them dearly. Pram's injury weighed on him heavily. Clenching his fists, Desir felt a sting as a drop of blood mixed with the rain. A deep puddle reflected the stormy sky above. He considered his earlier decision reckless. Raising one hand to his face, he studied it in confusion. Then, with sudden clarity, he opened his eyes and refocused. There was no time for self-pity. Back beneath the tree, Romantica remained beside Pram, her gaze shifting up to the dark clouds as the rain persisted. She turned just as Desir returned. Suppressing a yawn, she asked where he had gone. Her eyes scanned him, then widened in alarm. She pointed out that while he was away, they could have been attacked by another group. Mid-sentence, Romantica paused. Her concern shifted to something deeper as she stared at Desir's face. Something about him looked off. He explained that he had gone to scout the surroundings and reassured her not to worry about how he looked. Romantica continued watching him with unease while Desir turned his attention to Pram, who began to stir. The boy slowly opened one eye and made a faint sound, signaling his return to consciousness. Desir crouched in front of him, smiling with relief. He gently told Pram they needed to press on. Startled but cooperative, Pram pushed himself up from under the tree. He pressed both hands to his legs, noting Desir's injuries. Desir reassured him once again and asked if he felt well enough to move forward. Pram nodded and affirmed that he was fine now. Meanwhile, Romantica's eyes landed on Pram's broken rapier. The once pristine weapon was now fractured, a painful reminder of the recent battle. Pram looked down at it silently. Desir stood and announced that since everyone was in decent condition, they should move out. Romantica raised her hand and glanced at the surrounding area with unease. The rain had intensified. She voiced her concern about traveling in such a downpour, noting that they were already drenched. Desir paused to consider her words and ultimately agreed. He extended his hand and pointed toward a specific direction, declaring that their next destination lay ahead. His finger aimed directly at the clock tower silhouetted through the haze. A glowing notification hovered in the air, confirming the next task. The towering structure stood like a dark sentinel, absorbing the relentless downpour. Their mission was now clear. They needed to stop the clock tower, where the power source was located, and destroy it. The trio gazed ahead into the thick sheets of rain. Pram stood between Desir and Romantica, guilt-heavy in his voice as he apologized for slowing them down. Romantica offered a reassuring smile and told him not to blame himself. In fact, it was thanks to him that they were still alive. Desir observed them silently. Despite the cold and wet conditions, the group pressed forward. Romantica shivered and muttered about the temperature, prompting Pram to encourage her, insisting it would be warmer inside the tower. Desir glanced at his own hand, now bearing a distinct set of bite marks. Rain traced lines down his fingers. He silently vowed not to repeat his past mistakes. Behind him, Romantica and Pram looked back and smiled. Desir clenched his fists, then followed after them. Elsewhere, flashes of blue light broke through the sky. Ajest moved swiftly through the battlefield, her blade slicing through Kildra rats with mechanical precision. Each strike shattered the creatures into fragments of glowing blue crystals. Around her, shimmering remains littered the area. One of her team members remarked that with the defeat of the main boss, the rats had disappeared. Another warned him not to jinx it. The team looked around cautiously, tension still thick in the air. A player approached Ajest and informed her that 2 of their teammates had been eliminated. Ajest narrowed her eyes, absorbing the loss. Their numbers had dropped to 7. Percival crossed his arms beside her and observed that their odds remained favorable. Out of 18 remaining participants, 7 were from their group. Securing a high-ranking title was still within reach. Despite the loss, Ajest led the group forward. She explained that they needed to regroup and reposition. Just then, she noticed a faint gust of wind brushing past her legs. Her eyes widened. Something was wrong. A split second later, blue magical beams streaked toward them. The sudden attack sought to freeze her team in place. Percival ducked behind a block of ice, shocked by the sniper's precision. He called out in confusion, and Ajest confirmed his suspicion: it was a sniper. She immediately barked orders, telling the tanks to advance and form a defensive wall. Flanked by her team's shield bearers, she scanned the environment. Donetta stood nearby, noting that the attack had ceased. Ajest ordered them to stay alert and maintain formation as they advanced toward the tower. The forest grew thicker as they trudged through the storm. Rain pounded against their armor and soaked their clothes. Ajest could see how tired her teammates were, yet they pushed forward without complaint. Her gaze shifted. That sniper attack had been far too precise, too powerful. It didn't make sense. Someone with such refined magical skill shouldn't exist among the first-year candidates. Her jaw clenched. This entrance exam was far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Back at the tower, water cascaded down its black walls. A narrow window overlooked the surrounding terrain. Inside, Desir stood still, watching Romantica and Pram take position nearby. He adjusted his glove tightly around his wrist, preparing himself. The battle ahead would not be easy.